Chapter 1. Seeds of Doubt. Amelia Bones could have dismissed it. The slight tremor in the boy's hands when he first sat down, the way his shoulders hunched inward as though he were trying to make himself smaller, the careful way he kept his sleeves pulled down over his wrists. She could have attributed it all to nerves. After all, any 15-year-old would be terrified facing a formal hearing before the Wizengamot. But Amelia hadn't become head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement by ignoring details that didn't quite fit. The courtroom was stifling in the way that underground chambers always were, thick with the weight of centuries of magical proceedings and the particular tension that came from putting a child on trial. Harry Potter sat in the defendant's chair with his back straight and his chin up, but Amelia could see the cost of maintaining that posture. There was something brittle about his composure, like glass that had been cracked but not yet shattered. "State your full name for the record," she said, her voice carrying easily across the stone chamber. "Harry James Potter." His voice was steady, but quiet. Too quiet for a boy who had faced down you-know-who multiple times. Amelia had read the reports, had heard the stories. This was supposed to be the boy who lived, the one who had stood toe-to-toe with Death Eaters and lived to tell about it. The small, pale figure before her seemed impossibly young. As the hearing progressed, Amelia found herself watching Harry more than listening to the testimony. She noted the way he flinched when Cornelius Fudge raised his voice, a barely perceptible movement that spoke of someone accustomed to loud voices, meaning danger. She observed how he kept his hands flat on his knees, fingers splayed as though ready to push himself up and run. Most telling of all was the way he responded to direct questions, always truthful, she could tell, but delivered with the careful precision of someone who had learned that the wrong words could have consequences. When Harry spoke about the Dementors, about conjuring his Patronus to save himself and his cousin, there was no boasting in his tone, no pride in his magical ability or satisfaction in having saved them both. Just a weary recounting of facts, as though reciting something that had happened to someone else. Amelia had seen that detachment before, in the testimonies of abuse victims who had learned to separate themselves from their own experiences as a survival mechanism. The hearing concluded with Harry's charges dismissed, as they should have been from the start, in Amelia's opinion. The boy had acted in self-defense, protecting not only himself, but a Muggle relative. Any competent magical law enforcement officer could see that. But as the Wizengamot members filed out and Harry was reunited with his escort, Amelia lingered. She watched as an elderly woman approached Harry, her face creased with worry and relief. Mrs. Figg, if Amelia remembered correctly from the witness list. The woman's hands fluttered around Harry like she wanted to embrace him, but wasn't sure if she was allowed. There was something heartbreaking about the way Harry submitted to her gentle fussing, accepting care as though it were an unexpected gift rather than something he deserved. "Mrs. Figg, isn't it?" Amelia approached them, her voice gentler than the booming tone she used in official proceedings. The old woman looked up with sharp, intelligent eyes that reminded Amelia why squibs often made excellent observers. They saw the magical world from the outside, noticed things that wizards took for granted. "Yes, Madam Bones. Arabella Figg. I've been keeping an eye on Harry for years now." There was something in the way she said it, a weight behind the words that suggested she had seen more than she was comfortable with. Harry tensed beside her, and Amelia noticed how he seemed to shrink into himself when he became the focus of adult attention. "It's all right, Harry," she said, surprised by the protective instinct that flared in her chest. "I just wanted to make sure you got home safely." Home. Harry repeated the word like it tasted strange in his mouth. There was no warmth in his expression when he said it, no anticipation of comfort or safety, just resignation. "Mrs. Figg," Amelia said carefully, "perhaps we could speak for a moment. Privately." The older woman glanced at Harry, who nodded quickly. "I'll wait by the lifts," he said, his voice still that same careful monotone. As he walked away, Amelia noticed the slight limp he tried to hide, the way he favored his left side. She made a mental note to ask about that. "He's a good boy," Mrs. Figg said the moment Harry was out of earshot. "Too good, if you ask me. Never complains, never asks for anything. Even when—" She trailed off, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Even when what, Mrs. Figg?" Amelia kept her voice neutral, professional. She had learned long ago that leading questions often produced less reliable information than patient silence. Mrs. Figg glanced around the emptying courtroom as though checking for listeners. "I shouldn't say anything. Professor Dumbledore made it very clear that Harry's situation was delicate, that his protection depended on certain arrangements remaining unchanged." She wrung her hands together. "But that boy doesn't get enough to eat. Madame Bones. I've seen him rummaging through my bins looking for scraps. I've seen the bars on his bedroom window. And the bruises." The words hung in the air between them like an accusation. Amelia felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What kind of bruises, Mrs. Figg?" "The kind that come from hands, mostly. Sometimes belts." Mrs. Figg's voice was barely above a whisper. "I tried to help when I could. Invited him over for tea, gave him extra food when his relatives weren't watching. But there's only so much a neighbor can do when the people who are supposed to care for him—" She shook her head. "They hate him, Madame Bones. Hate everything about him. And he knows it." Amelia studied the older woman's face, looking for signs of exaggeration or misunderstanding. She found only genuine distress and years of accumulated worry. "Have you ever reported your concerns to anyone?" "To who?" Mrs. Figg's laugh was bitter. "Professor Dumbledore placed him there. Said it was for the best, for his protection. When I tried to bring up my concerns, he told me the situation was temporary, and that Harry was stronger than he looked. But 15 years isn't temporary, Madame Bones. 15 years is a childhood." The number hit Amelia like a physical blow. 15 years of what Mrs. Figg was describing. 15 years of hunger and bruises and bars on windows, all under the nose of the most powerful wizard in Britain. All sanctioned by the man who was supposed to be looking out for Harry's best interests. "Thank you for telling me this, Mrs. Figg," Amelia said finally. "Would you be willing to document these concerns formally, if needed?" The older woman nodded without hesitation. "That boy deserves better than what he's got. He's been taking care of himself since he was small, but he shouldn't have to. No child should have to." After Mrs. Figg left to collect Harry, Amelia stood alone in the empty courtroom, her mind racing. She thought about the hearing, about Harry's careful answers and guarded posture. She thought about Dumbledore's testimony, the way he had spoken about Harry's home situation in vague terms, emphasizing the protection the boy received while glossing over the specifics of his care. The lift ride back to level 2 felt longer than usual. Amelia's office was waiting for her, paperwork stacked neatly on her desk, the usual demands of running the largest department in the ministry, but she couldn't concentrate on budget reports or personnel reviews. Her mind kept returning to a thin boy with 2 old eyes and careful hands that shook when he thought no one was looking. "Kingsley," she called as she passed the Aura bullpen. Kingsley Shacklebolt looked up from his desk, his expression shifting to attention when he saw her face. "Ma'am? I need you to pull a file for me. Complete DMLE records for Harry Potter. Everything we have." Kingsley's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded. "Any particular reason, ma'am?" Following up on some inconsistencies that came up during his hearing. It wasn't the full truth, but it wasn't a lie either. Amelia had built her career on following inconsistencies wherever they led, even when, especially when, they led to uncomfortable places. 20 minutes later, Kingsley returned with a folder that was disappointingly thin. "This is everything, ma'am. Most of it's from the last few years. Incident reports from his time at Hogwarts. There's not much about his home situation." Amelia accepted the file with a frown. For someone as famous as Harry Potter, someone who had been in the public eye since he was a baby, the official record of his welfare was remarkably sparse. She settled at her desk and opened the folder, spreading the contents across her blotter. What she found was troubling in what it didn't contain. There were incident reports from Hogwarts, trips to the hospital wing for injuries sustained during various adventures, a concerning pattern of burns, cuts, and what looked like the after-effects of severe, magical exhaustion. But there were no welfare checks, no reports on his home environment, no documentation of his guardian's suitability for caring for a magical child. More disturbing still were the gaps in documentation. Harry's placement with his Muggle relatives was noted in a single, brief report filed by Albus Dumbledore in November 1981. The language was formal and sparse. Harry Potter has been placed with his maternal relatives for his protection. The arrangement provides both magical safeguards and appropriate guardianship for the child's welfare. No follow-up reports. No verification that the protection mentioned was actually functioning. No confirmation that the child's welfare was being maintained. Amelia turned to her personal files, the ones she kept locked in her desk drawer. Every head of the DMLE maintained unofficial records, notes and observations that didn't belong in formal reports, but were too important to ignore. She found what she was looking for in a folder marked Dumbledore Correspondence, a series of letters exchanged over the years regarding various matters of mutual interest. The relevant letter was dated December 1981, barely a month after Harry's placement. In it, Amelia had inquired about establishing regular welfare checks for the Potter boy, given his unique circumstances and the trauma he had undoubtedly experienced. Dumbledore's response was polite but firm. Such checks would compromise the protective measures in place and were unnecessary given the care Harry was receiving from his family. Family. The word sat uneasily in Amelia's mind as she read Mrs. Figg's description of the Dursleys. Hands that left bruises weren't family hands. Bars on bedroom windows weren't family protection. Hatred wasn't family love. She reached for her quill and began making notes, documenting every inconsistency she had observed. Harry's physical condition during the hearing, his behavioral responses to authority figures, the gaps in his official file, Mrs. Figg's testimony about years of neglect and abuse, Dumbledore's resistance to oversight or welfare checks. By the time she finished, the sun had set outside her office windows. The ministry had grown quiet around her, most employees having returned to their homes and families. The irony wasn't lost on her. While she sat in her comfortable office, investigating Harry Potter's living conditions, the boy himself was returning to whatever passed for home in his life. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in." Susan Bones poked her head around the door, her young face bright with curiosity and affection. "Aunt Amelia, I was wondering if you were planning to come home for dinner. Mum's making that roast you like." Amelia looked at her niece, 17 years old, safe and loved and well-fed, preparing for her final year at Hogwarts without the weight of the world on her shoulders, and felt a sharp pang of something that might have been guilt. Susan had never wanted for anything, had never questioned that she was valued and protected and cherished. It was what every child deserved. "In a few minutes, dear," Amelia said, closing the file but not putting it away. "Susan, you know Harry Potter, don't you, from Hogwarts?" Susan's expression grew thoughtful. "A bit. Different houses and he's younger. But everyone knows Harry." "Why? What's your impression of him? As a person, I mean." "He's—" Susan paused, considering her words carefully. "Sad, I think. Even when he's smiling or talking with his friends, there's something sad about him. Like he's always waiting for something bad to happen. The other students think he's brave, and he is. But it's not the good kind of brave. It's the kind that comes from having no choice." The observation was more insightful than Amelia had expected, and it aligned disturbingly well with her own observations from the hearing. Has he ever talked about his home life, his family? Never. Susan's response was immediate and certain. Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger are his best friends, and even they don't know much about his summers. I heard Hermione say once that she'd never been invited to visit him, and she seemed hurt by it. Most students complain about going home for holidays, but Harry never says anything. He just disappears. After Susan left, Amelia sat alone with her thoughts and the inadequate file spread before her. She thought about her conversation with Mrs. Figg, about the bruises and the hunger and the bars on windows. She thought about Susan's observation that Harry Potter was the kind of brave that came from having no choice. She thought about a system that had failed to protect a child for 15 years because the adults responsible had decided that protection looked like sacrifice. The choice before her was clear, even if the consequences weren't. She could file away the inconsistencies, trust that greater minds than hers had made the right decisions, return to the comfortable routine of managing the DMLE without asking uncomfortable questions about one of the most powerful men in their world. Or she could do what she had sworn to do when she took this position: pursue justice wherever the evidence led, regardless of who might be discomforted by the truth. Amelia reached for her official ministry stationery and began to write. The letter was brief and formal, requesting access to any additional files related to Harry Potter's placement and welfare. She addressed it to the Department for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, the Improper Use of Magic Office, and the Wizengamot Administration Services. If there were other documents, other reports, other evidence of oversight or the lack thereof, she intended to find them. She sealed the letters and placed them in her outgoing correspondence tray. Tomorrow she would begin asking the questions that apparently no one had thought to ask for 15 years. Tomorrow she would start following the inconsistencies wherever they led, even if, especially if, they led to the uncomfortable truth that the wizarding world's greatest hero had been failed by the very people sworn to protect him. But tonight, she would go home to her family. She would eat dinner with her sister and her niece. She would listen to Susan's stories about her friends at Hogwarts, and she would remember what it felt like to be 17 and safe and loved. And she would think about a boy who had never had that safety, who had learned to expect pain instead of care, who had grown up believing that love was something that happened to other people. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave her office, Amelia made herself a promise. Harry Potter had spent 15 years being failed by the adults who should have protected him. She would not be one more adult who looked the other way, who chose comfort over conscience, who decided that someone else's well-being was an acceptable price to pay for her own peace of mind. The investigation would begin tomorrow, formally and officially. But in her heart, it had already begun the moment she saw a thin boy with shaking hands sit down in the defendant's chair and prepare to defend himself, yet again, to a world that had never bothered to defend him. Chapter 2. Official Inquiry. The responses to Amelia's letters arrived faster than she had expected, which was telling in itself. By 10 o'clock the next morning, her desk was covered with interdepartmental memos, each one variations on the same theme. There were no additional files, no welfare reports, no follow-up documentation, no oversight records beyond what she had already seen. Amelia stared at the stack of brief, formal replies and felt a cold certainty settle in her chest. In her 23 years with the DMLE, she had never encountered a case where a high-profile individual had so little documentation. Even routine placement of magical children generated more paperwork than what existed for Harry Potter. The absence of records wasn't an oversight, it was deliberate. "Auras Shacklebolt, Tonks and Proudfoot," she called across the bullpen. "My office, please." The 3 senior Auras filed in, their expressions shifting from casual professionalism to alert concern as they registered her tone. Kingsley Shacklebolt, her most trusted investigator, took the chair across from her desk while Nymphadora Tonks and Proudfoot flanked him. These were her best people, the ones she trusted with sensitive cases that required both skill and discretion. "I'm opening a formal investigation," Amelia said without preamble. "Child welfare concerns regarding Harry Potter's placement with his Muggle relatives." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Kingsley's dark eyes grew troubled, while Tonks's hair shifted from its usual bright pink to a more subdued brown, always a sign that she was thinking hard. Proudfoot simply looked grim, which was his default expression when cases involved children. "What kind of concerns, Mum?" Proudfoot asked carefully. "The kind that suggest 15 years of systematic neglect and abuse have gone undocumented and uninvestigated." Amelia slid copies of Mrs. Figg's unofficial statement across her desk. "Read these, and then tell me how a child in our community has been failed so thoroughly by every system meant to protect him." As her auras reviewed the documents, Amelia watched their faces. Proudfoot's jaw tightened progressively with each page. Tonks made a soft sound of distress that she quickly suppressed. Kingsley read through everything twice before looking up, his expression carefully neutral in the way that meant he was struggling with conflicting loyalties. "This is," Tonks began, then stopped, her hair now cycling through darker shades of blue and purple. "These are serious allegations. If they're accurate, they're credible enough to warrant investigation," Amelia interrupted. "Mrs. Figg has been Harry's neighbour for 15 years. She's observed these conditions consistently over time. Her testimony alone would be sufficient grounds for opening an inquiry, but there's more." She gestured to the stack of responses on her desk. "There's virtually no official documentation of Harry's welfare since his initial placement in 1981. No home visits, no welfare checks, no verification that the protective measures cited in his placement were actually functioning or necessary. For a child as high-profile as Harry Potter, that level of administrative negligence is either gross incompetence or deliberate concealment." "Mum," Kingsley said slowly, "you're talking about investigating decisions made by Albus Dumbledore." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Amelia studied her most senior aura, noting the careful way he avoided her eyes, the tension in his shoulders that suggested internal conflict. "I'm talking about investigating the welfare of a child who may have been systematically abused for 15 years while the adults responsible for his protection looked the other way." "With respect," Kingsley said, "Professor Dumbledore isn't just anyone. He's the chief warlock of the Wizengamot, supreme mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards, and arguably the most powerful wizard alive. If he placed Harry with his relatives, he had good reasons." Amelia leaned back in her chair, studying Kingsley with the sharp attention she usually reserved for suspects. "Are you suggesting that a child's welfare is less important than protecting someone's reputation, regardless of their position?" "I'm suggesting," Kingsley said carefully, "that there may be factors we're not aware of. The war against you-know-who created unusual circumstances. Extraordinary measures might have been necessary for Harry's protection." "Extraordinary measures like allowing him to be starved and beaten?" Tonks's voice was sharp with indignation. "Because that's what these reports describe, Kingsley. Look at this again." She thrust Mrs. Figg's statement toward him. "Bruises that match handprints. A child thin enough that his neighbour was feeding him scraps. Bars on his bedroom window. When have any of those things ever constituted protection?" Proudfoot cleared his throat. "If I may, Mum, there's precedent for this kind of investigation. The Magical Children's Welfare Act of 1962 gives the DMLE authority to investigate suspected abuse, regardless of who made the original placement decision. We don't need anyone's permission to ensure a child's safety." Amelia felt a flicker of satisfaction. This was why she valued Proudfoot, his encyclopedic knowledge of magical law and his unwavering commitment to protocol. "Thank you, Proudfoot. You're quite right. The question isn't whether we can investigate, but how we proceed." She turned back to Kingsley, whose expression had grown more conflicted. "Kingsley, I need to know if you can set aside your personal feelings about Professor Dumbledore and focus on the evidence. If you can't, I'll understand. But I'll need to know now." For a long moment, Kingsley didn't respond. His hands rested flat on his knees in a gesture that reminded Amelia uncomfortably of Harry's carefully controlled posture during his hearing. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. I took an oath when I became an Auror, to protect those who cannot protect themselves, regardless of who they need protection from. If Harry Potter has been harmed by the people who were supposed to care for him, he met her eyes, then we need to know the truth. Good. Amelia felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease. Tonks, I want you to conduct a formal interview with Mrs. Figg. Get everything documented properly. What she's observed, when she observed it, who else might have witnessed these conditions. Proudfoot, research the legal framework for investigating historical abuse cases and the procedures for removing a minor from an unsuitable placement. Kingsley. She paused, knowing this next assignment would be the most difficult for him. I need you to arrange a formal interview with Harry. He'll need to be comfortable, safe. Bring him here to the ministry rather than conducting it at Hogwarts or his relative's home. And Kingsley, when you speak with him, I want you to remember that he's the victim here, not a suspect. After her Aurors left, Amelia sat alone in her office, staring at the sparse file that represented 15 years of Harry Potter's life. She thought about her conversation with Susan the previous evening, about a boy who was the kind of brave that came from having no choice. She thought about Mrs. Figg's description of a child who never complained, never asked for anything, even when he was hungry and hurt and alone. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Come in. The door opened to admit a nervous-looking junior clerk from the minister's office. Begging your pardon, ma'am, but the minister requests your immediate presence in his office. Amelia checked her pocket watch. It was barely 11 o'clock. Word of her investigation had reached Cornelius Fudge's ears remarkably quickly, which suggested that someone had been watching her correspondence closely. She gathered the relevant files and followed the clerk through the maze of ministry corridors to the opulent ministerial suite. Fudge was pacing behind his desk when she entered, his face flushed, and his lime-green bowler hat askew. Amelia, thank Merlin you're here. I've just received some very disturbing reports about an investigation you've opened. Please tell me there's been some kind of misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, Cornelius, Amelia said, settling into the chair across from his desk without invitation. The DMLE has opened a formal inquiry into child welfare concerns regarding Harry Potter's placement with his Muggle relatives. Fudge's face grew redder. You can't be serious. Harry Potter? The boy's a hero, Amelia. He defeated you-know-who. He's perfectly fine. He's 15 years old, Amelia replied calmly, and there's credible evidence that he's been systematically abused by his guardians for most of his life. The fact that he's accomplished remarkable things doesn't negate the possibility that he's been harmed. But Professor Dumbledore placed him there, Fudge sputtered. Albus Dumbledore, Amelia. He doesn't make mistakes about these things. Amelia studied the minister with growing distaste. In the 5 years since Fudge had taken office, she had watched him grow increasingly dependent on others' opinions, particularly Dumbledore's. His first instinct was always to avoid making difficult decisions, to defer to more powerful figures rather than take responsibility himself. Professor Dumbledore is not infallible, she said. And regardless of who made the original placement decision, the DMLE has a legal obligation to investigate credible reports of child abuse. I would hope that the Minister for Magic would support protecting our most vulnerable citizens. Of course I support protecting children, Fudge said quickly. But this isn't just any child, Amelia. This is Harry Potter. The publicity alone could be catastrophic. Imagine what the Daily Prophet would make of allegations that the boy who lived was abused by Muggles, the damage to magical Muggle relations, the questions about our competence. So your concern is public relations rather than Harry's welfare. The words came out sharper than Amelia had intended, but she didn't regret them. Fudge's expression grew defensive. My concern is for the stability of our society. We're still recovering from the war, still rebuilding trust in our institutions. An investigation like this could undermine everything we've worked for. and ignoring credible evidence of child abuse could undermine our integrity as law enforcement officers, Amelia countered. Which do you think is more important, Minister? For a moment, Fudge simply stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. Then he straightened his shoulders and assumed what he probably thought was an authoritative posture. I'm instructing you to close this investigation, Amelia, for the good of the wizarding community. The words hung between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Amelia had been expecting this moment, had prepared for it during the long night she'd spent reviewing the inadequate files and making her decision to investigate. She stood slowly, her hand resting on the back of her chair, and let the silence stretch until Fudge began to fidget. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement, she said finally, her voice carrying the full weight of her authority, operates independently of political pressure in matters of criminal investigation. That independence is enshrined in magical law specifically to prevent this kind of interference. I cannot and will not close an investigation based on political considerations rather than evidence. Fudge's face went through several shades of red before settling on purple. You're making a serious mistake, Amelia. Professor Dumbledore won't appreciate this interference in matters he's handled personally. Then perhaps Professor Dumbledore should have ensured that those matters were handled properly in the first place, Amelia replied. Good day, Minister. She left his office with her head high and her resolve strengthened. The political pressure was beginning already, but she had faced worse. The question now was how far Dumbledore's allies would be willing to go to protect him from scrutiny. Meanwhile, at Hogwarts, Susan Bones was trying to concentrate on her Transfiguration essay and failing miserably. Her mind kept drifting to her conversation with Aunt Amelia the previous evening, to the carefully controlled way her aunt had asked about Harry Potter. Susan had known her aunt long enough to recognize when she was working on something important, something that required her particular brand of methodical investigation. She glanced across the common room to where Harry sat with Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger, bent over what looked like a Defense Against the Dark Arts assignment. He looked tired, she noticed, but then Harry always looked tired. There was something about him that reminded her of an animal that was always listening for predators, always ready to run or fight, depending on which would keep him safer. Harry, she called softly, trying not to disturb the other students, scattered around the common room. Could I borrow you for a moment? I need help with this arithmancy problem, and I heard you're brilliant at it. It was a transparent excuse. Harry wasn't even taking arithmancy, but he seemed grateful for the interruption. He joined her at a table near the window, away from his friend's curious glances. I'm not actually stuck on arithmancy, Susan said, once they were seated. I wanted to ask you something, but I didn't want to do it in front of Ron and Hermione. Harry's expression immediately grew guarded. What about? Susan studied his face, noting the way his shoulders tensed and his hands moved to rest flat on the table. It was the same careful positioning she'd observed during their brief encounters over the years, the same watchful alertness that suggested he was always prepared for disappointment or worse. You know my aunt is Amelia Bones, right? Head of the DMLE. Harry nodded, his wariness increasing. She was at my hearing. She was fair. She mentioned that yesterday, Susan said carefully. She seemed concerned about you. Not about anything you'd done, she added quickly, seeing him tense further. About whether you were okay, whether you were being looked after properly. For a moment, Harry didn't respond. Susan could see him weighing his words, calculating how much truth was safe to share. It broke her heart a little, watching someone her age have to think so carefully about such a simple question. I'm fine, he said finally, but the words carried no conviction. Why was she asking? Susan leaned forward slightly, keeping her voice low. Harry, can I tell you something about my aunt? She doesn't ask questions like that casually. If she's concerned about you, it's because she has reason to be. And if she has reason to be concerned... She trailed off, unsure how to finish without revealing more than she should. "It doesn't matter," Harry said quietly. "There's nothing anyone can do anyway. It's just how things are." The resignation in his voice was devastating. Susan had grown up in a family where problems were solved, where adults protected children as a matter of course. The idea that someone her age had learned to accept suffering as inevitable was incomprehensible to her. "That's not true, Harry. Adults are supposed to protect children, not hurt them. If someone's hurting you, no one's hurting me," Harry interrupted, but his voice was too quick, too defensive. "I can take care of myself." Susan reached across the table and gently touched his hand. He flinched but didn't pull away. "You shouldn't have to take care of yourself. You're 16. You should be worried about NYWTS and Quidditch, and whether that girl you fancies you back. You shouldn't be." She gestured helplessly at his guarded posture, his careful words, the shadows under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. Harry stared at their hands for a long moment. When he looked up, Susan was shocked by the vulnerability in his green eyes. "Do you think," he said slowly, "that if someone deserved better, they would have gotten it by now?" The question hit Susan like a physical blow. She thought about her own childhood, about unconditional love and birthday parties, and knowing without doubt that she was valued and cherished. She thought about Harry, who had saved their world multiple times, and still believed he might not deserve basic kindness. "I think," she said firmly, "that sometimes good people end up in bad situations through no fault of their own. And I think that when other people find out about those situations, they have a responsibility to help." Harry searched her face, as though looking for signs of deception or pity. Whatever he saw there seemed to reassure him slightly. "Your aunt really is investigating something, isn't she?" Susan nodded. "I think so." "And Harry? Whatever she finds, whatever happens, you don't have to be brave about this one. You don't have to protect the people who should have been protecting you." That evening, back in London, Amelia was reviewing Tonks's detailed interview notes when her secretary knocked on her office door. "Ma'am, Professor Dumbledore is here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's regarding an urgent matter." Amelia felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her voice level. "Send him in, please." Albus Dumbledore entered her office with his usual serene demeanor, his blue eyes twinkling behind half-moon spectacles. He was exactly as she remembered from their brief interactions over the years, tall, commanding, radiating the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of being the most powerful wizard in the room. Today, however, there was something different about him, a tension beneath the grandfatherly facade that suggested he was not as calm as he appeared. "Amelia," he said warmly, settling into the chair across from her desk, without invitation. "Thank you for seeing me so late in the day. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I felt we should speak privately about a matter of mutual concern. If you're referring to my investigation into Harry Potter's welfare, it's hardly private," Amelia replied coolly. "It's a formal DMLE inquiry, properly documented and conducted according to established protocols." Dumbledore's smile faltered slightly. "Ah, then the rumors I've been hearing are accurate. I had hoped there might be some misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding. I've opened an investigation based on credible evidence of child abuse and neglect, evidence that suggests Harry has been systematically mistreated by his guardians for most of his life, while the adults responsible for his welfare looked the other way." The words were carefully chosen, deliberately provocative. Amelia wanted to see how Dumbledore would respond when confronted directly with the implications of his decisions. For a moment, the older wizard's carefully controlled expression slipped, revealing something that might have been pain or guilt. But it was quickly replaced by gentle sadness, the sort of expression one might use when explaining disappointing realities to a child. "My dear Amelia," he said softly, "I understand your concern, truly I do. But I fear you may not fully understand the complexities of Harry's situation. The protection he receives from his relatives is not merely emotional or physical. It is magical in nature, woven into the very fabric of the blood wards that keep him safe from those who would do him harm. I've read about blood protection, Amelia said. Ancient magic, requiring sacrifice and love. But from what I've observed, and what witnesses have reported, there's precious little love in the Dursley household. If anything, they seem to despise him. Love takes many forms, Dumbledore replied. But there was something hollow about the words. Petunia's protection of Harry may not manifest in ways we might expect, but it has kept him alive when all other defenses might have failed. Amelia leaned forward, fixing Dumbledore with her most penetrating stare. Professor, I've spent my career investigating crimes against children. I know what abuse looks like, and I know what protection looks like. What Harry has experienced is not protection. It's systematic trauma disguised as necessity. You speak of trauma, Dumbledore said, his voice growing sharper. But consider the alternative. Harry is not merely a child, Amelia. He carries within him a fragment of Voldemort's soul, making him a target for forces you cannot imagine. The Dursleys' treatment of him, while regrettable, has ensured his survival. The admission hung in the air like a confession. Dumbledore seemed to realize what he had revealed, because his expression shifted to something approaching alarm. But it was too late. Amelia had caught the implication, and her mind was already racing to understand its full meaning. A fragment of Voldemort's soul, she repeated slowly. You're talking about a Horcrux. Dumbledore's silence was answer enough. You've known all along that Harry carries part of Voldemort's soul, and you still placed him with people who would ensure he grew up believing he was worthless and unloved. Amelia's voice was deadly quiet. You deliberately chose guardians who would traumatize him because you thought it would make him more willing to sacrifice himself when the time came. You oversimplify, do I? Amelia stood, her hands flat on her desk. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've spent 15 years grooming a child to die, using his own relatives as tools to break down his sense of self-worth. That's not protection, Professor. That's psychological warfare waged against a child by the people who claimed to care about his welfare. Dumbledore rose as well, his blue eyes no longer twinkling. For the first time in their conversation, he looked genuinely dangerous, power radiating from him like heat from a flame. You do not understand the burden I carry, Amelia. The decisions I've been forced to make to ensure that our world survives. Harry's sacrifice may be necessary to defeat Voldemort permanently. Harry's sacrifice, Amelia repeated, her voice dripping with disgust. He's 16 years old, and you're already planning his death. Does he know? Does he understand that his famous protector has been preparing him for slaughter since he was a baby? Enough. The word cracked through the air like a whip. This investigation ends now, Amelia. For Harry's sake, as much as everyone else's, there are forces at work that you cannot comprehend, decisions that must be made for the greater good, regardless of their personal cost. Amelia straightened to her full height, drawing on every ounce of authority she had accumulated over 2 decades of law enforcement. The investigation continues, Professor, and nothing you've told me tonight has changed my determination to see it through. In fact, you've given me additional grounds for concern about Harry's welfare. I could have this investigation shut down with a single word to the minister, Dumbledore said quietly, but there was steel beneath the soft tone. You could try, Amelia acknowledged, but the DMLE's independence is protected by law, and I've documented everything properly. Any attempt to interfere with a legitimate child welfare investigation would raise questions you might not want to answer publicly. Questions about what you've known, when you've known it, and why you've allowed it to continue. They stared at each other across her desk, 2 formidable figures locked in a battle of wills. Finally, Dumbledore stepped back, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. I had hoped you might understand, he said sadly, "that you might trust that I have acted in everyone's best interests, including Harry's." "I might have," Amelia replied, "before you told me that you've known he was carrying a piece of Voldemort's soul while allowing him to be systematically abused by his guardians. Now I understand exactly what you've done, and why you've done it." "The investigation continues, Professor, and if I find evidence that Harry has been deliberately traumatized to make him more compliant with your plans for his eventual sacrifice—" She let the threat hang unfinished. After Dumbledore left, Amelia sat alone in her office, her hand shaking slightly as the full implications of their conversation sank in. She had suspected that there were hidden factors in Harry's placement, political considerations that might have overridden normal welfare concerns. But this was worse than anything she had imagined. A child carrying a fragment of a dark wizard's soul, deliberately placed with abusive relatives to ensure he would grow up broken enough to accept his own death as necessary. It was a level of calculated manipulation that turned her stomach, made all the worse by the fact that it had been orchestrated by the wizard their entire society trusted to make such decisions. She pulled out parchment and began writing furiously, documenting every word of her conversation with Dumbledore while it was fresh in her memory. This investigation had begun as a child welfare case, but it had just become something much larger. If Harry Potter had been deliberately traumatized to serve someone else's war strategy, then every assumption about the wizarding world's most trusted leader needed to be questioned. The investigation would continue, regardless of who tried to stop it. But now Amelia understood that she wasn't just fighting to protect one boy from his abusive relatives. She was fighting to expose a conspiracy that went to the very heart of their society's power structure. And if she was right about what Dumbledore had revealed, then Harry Potter wasn't just a victim of neglect. He was a victim of the most sophisticated psychological manipulation she had ever encountered, carried out by the one man everyone trusted to protect him. The stakes had just become much higher than she had ever imagined. Chapter 3. Gathering Evidence. Nymphadora Tonks had never liked suburban Muggle neighborhoods. There was something unsettling about the relentless uniformity, the way each house seemed to be trying to outdo its neighbors in aggressive normalcy. But Privet Drive in Little Whinging took that discomfort to new heights. Even her hair, usually a reliable indicator of her emotional state, seemed unable to settle on a color as she walked down the pristine street, cycling nervously between muddy brown and sickly yellow. Number 4 stood out only in how determinedly it tried not to stand out. The garden was immaculate, the windows gleaming, the front door painted a shade of blue that managed to be both cheerful and somehow menacing. Tonks could see why Dumbledore might have thought it looked respectable from the outside. But she was an aura, trained to see past surface appearances, and there was something wrong with this house that made her skin crawl. She approached the neighbor to the left first, a tidy little house with lace curtains and a garden gnome that looked disapproving. The woman who answered the door was elderly, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and the sort of posture that suggested she spent considerable time watching her neighbors. "Mrs. Henderson." Tonks showed her identification, noting how the woman's eyes widened at the mention of law enforcement. "I'm investigating some concerns regarding the Potter family at number 4. I understand you've been neighbors for many years?" "Potter?" Mrs. Henderson's voice took on a distinctly disapproving tone. "Oh, that poor boy. Come in, dear, come in. I've been wondering when someone would finally ask about that household." The sitting room was exactly what Tonks had expected. Chintz furniture, doilies, and photographs of grandchildren scattered across every surface. But Mrs. Henderson's expression was serious as she settled into her chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "That boy," she began without preamble, "has never had a proper childhood. Never. I've lived here for 23 years, and I've watched him grow up through my kitchen window. The things I've seen—" She shook her head, her mouth pinched with distress. "What kinds of things, Mrs. Henderson?" "Locked in his room for days at a time, Bars on his windows. Actual bars, like he was a criminal. The Dursleys would tell people he was at a special school for troubled children. But I could see him up there, poor mite, staring out through those bars like a caged bird. Tonks made careful notes, her quill scratching across the parchment with increasing urgency. When did you first notice these unusual arrangements? Oh, from the beginning. He couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 when they first put bars on his room. Said it was for his own safety. But what kind of safety requires prison bars? Mrs. Henderson's voice was growing more agitated. And the food situation. Dear God, the food. That boy was always thin, always hungry-looking. I used to see him in the garden, picking through the compost bin behind their shed. The quill nearly slipped from Tonks's fingers. He was eating from the compost? Looking for scraps, yes. Apple cores, potato peelings, anything edible they'd thrown away. This was when he was small, mind you, 6, 7 years old. A child shouldn't have to forage for food in his own garden. Mrs. Henderson's voice cracked slightly. I tried to help when I could, left sandwiches by the fence where he could reach them. But if the Dursleys caught him taking food from neighbours... She shuddered. What happened when they caught him? Shouting. Terrible shouting from Vernon Dursley. You could hear it 3 houses down. And then that boy would disappear for days, sometimes weeks. No sign of him anywhere. Mrs. Henderson leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. Mrs. Polkiss. She lives across the street. She called social services once. This was years ago, when Harry was maybe 8 or 9. Nothing came of it, though. The Dursleys cleaned up their act for the visit. And Harry... She paused, her expression growing troubled. Harry told the social worker everything was fine, smiled and said he was happy. But his eyes told a different story. Tonks spent another 40 minutes with Mrs. Henderson, documenting 15 years of observations that painted a picture of systematic abuse and neglect. Then she moved on to Mrs. Polkiss, who provided equally disturbing testimony about a child who was treated more like an unwanted pet than a family member. Never had friends over, Mrs. Polkiss reported, her voice thick with long-suppressed outrage. What child never has friends over? My grandson Piers used to play with their boy Dudley, but Harry was never allowed to join in, sent to his room when other children visited, like he was something to be ashamed of. By the time Tonks had interviewed 5 neighbours, her notes filled 16 pages of parchment, and her hair had settled into a grim shade of dark purple. Every conversation revealed new horrors, new examples of casual cruelty that had been witnessed and whispered about, but never officially reported. The picture that emerged was of a child who had been systematically dehumanized by the very people entrusted with his care. While Tonks gathered witness testimony, Proudfoot was conducting a different kind of investigation at number 4 itself. The Dursleys were away. Amelia had arranged for them to be called to a fabricated emergency at Grunning's, Vernon's drill company, leaving the house empty for a thorough magical examination. Proudfoot was methodical by nature, the sort of aura who believed that evidence told its own story if you knew how to listen. He started in the cupboard under the stairs, the space Mrs. Figg had mentioned as Harry's first bedroom. What he found there made his jaw clench with suppressed fury. The space was barely large enough for a grown man to crawl into, certainly not suitable for housing a child. But someone had lived here. The scratches on the walls were clear evidence of that. Small fingernail marks in the wood, concentrated around what would have been eye level for a young child. Words carved into the back wall, "Freak" in large, cruel letters, and below it, in smaller, more careful script, Harry James Potter, age 7. A 7-year-old child had carved his own name and age into the wall of his cupboard prison. Proudfoot closed his eyes and breathed deeply, forcing down the anger that threatened to compromise his professional objectivity. He cast a series of detection charms, magical analysis that would reveal the history of this space. The results were worse than he had feared. Trace magic showed years of confinement, the repeated activation of locking charms that had kept a small child trapped in darkness for days at a time. Biological evidence revealed malnutrition, stress hormones that had soaked into the very wood of the space, and there were other traces. Fear so intense it had left magical imprints, despair that had become part of the room's atmosphere. Upstairs, Harry's current bedroom told its own story. The bars on the windows were professionally installed, not a temporary measure but a permanent fixture. Proudfoot examined them with growing horror. They weren't just bars, they were charmed to prevent opening, designed to keep someone in rather than keep intruders out. The bedroom itself was Spartan to the point of cruelty. A narrow bed with a thin mattress, a small desk, and virtually no personal possessions. What few belongings Harry had were hidden. Books tucked under loose floorboards, a few photographs concealed inside pillowcases. Even in his own room, the boy had learned to hide the things that mattered to him. Proudfoot's most damning discovery came when he examined the locks on the bedroom door. Multiple locking charms, some of them quite sophisticated, designed to prevent escape from the inside. The magical residue told the story of countless nights when a child had been locked into this room, sometimes for days at a time, with minimal food and no access to the bathroom. He documented everything meticulously, his photographs capturing evidence that would be impossible to dispute. When he finally left number 4, Proudfoot felt like he needed a shower. He had investigated crime scenes that were less disturbing than the house where Harry Potter had spent his childhood. Meanwhile, at the ministry, Harry sat in a comfortable chair in Healer's examination room, trying not to think about why he was there. Amelia had been gentle when she explained the necessity of a medical evaluation, but Harry knew what it meant. They were looking for evidence of abuse, proof that he had been hurt by the people who were supposed to care for him. The healer, an elderly witch named Madame Clearwater, had kind eyes and gentle hands, but Harry still flinched when she approached him with her wand. He couldn't help it. Years of conditioning had taught him to expect pain when adults focused their attention on him. "I'm just going to run some basic diagnostic charms, Harry," she said softly. "They won't hurt, I promise. They're designed to check for old injuries, malnutrition, stress indicators, things that might need magical treatment." Harry nodded, his hands gripping the arms of the chair tightly enough to make his knuckles white. He knew what she would find. He had always known his body told stories he had never spoken aloud, but he had learned to ignore the evidence of his own suffering. The diagnostic charms revealed everything with brutal efficiency. Madame Clearwater's expression grew progressively more distressed as the magical assessment continued, her wand tracing patterns in the air that made visible the hidden history of Harry's body. "Dear Merlin," she whispered, her professional composure cracking slightly. "Harry, how many bones have you broken over the years?" "I don't know," Harry said quietly. "I stopped counting." The magical scan showed 17 separate bone fractures, most of them improperly healed, 3 cracked ribs that had never been set properly, 2 concussions that had gone untreated, chronic malnutrition that had stunted his growth and left him significantly underweight for his age and height. "Harry," Madame Clearwater said carefully, "these injuries, they're consistent with physical abuse, repeated physical abuse over many years. The malnutrition alone indicates severe neglect." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Would you like to tell me how you sustained these injuries?" Harry stared at his hands, noting the way his fingers trembled despite his efforts to control them. For 15 years, he had protected the Dursleys by staying silent, by accepting their explanations that he was clumsy, accident-prone, deserving of punishment. But sitting in this clean, quiet room, with a healer who looked at him with concern rather than disgust, the weight of keeping their secret suddenly felt unbearable. "Uncle Vernon has a temper," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Especially when I do magic by accident. He says I'm a freak, that I bring trouble on the family. Sometimes he—" Harry swallowed hard, the word sticking in his throat like broken glass. "Sometimes he hits me, With his hands, usually, but sometimes with his belt. Aunt Petunia mostly just withholds things. Food, mostly. She says I don't deserve to eat if I can't behave properly. Madame Clearwater's face went white with fury, but she kept her voice gentle. Harry, what you're describing is severe abuse. You understand that, don't you? Adults are never supposed to hurt children, no matter what the children have done. Harry looked up at her with eyes that were far too old for his 16-year-old face. But I did do magic. I couldn't control it, but I did it. They're muggles. They don't understand. It scared them. Being scared doesn't give anyone the right to hurt a child, Madame Clearwater said firmly. Nothing gives anyone that right. Harry, you were not responsible for what they did to you. You were a child. The words hit Harry like a physical blow. He had spent so many years accepting the Dursleys' explanations, believing that his treatment was somehow deserved, that hearing someone explicitly contradict that narrative felt like the ground shifting beneath his feet. I don't know what else I was supposed to do, he said, and his voice broke on the words. I tried to be good. I tried to follow their rules. But the magic, he gestured helplessly. I couldn't stop it from happening. Madame Clearwater set down her wand and moved closer to Harry's chair, her expression gentle but determined. Harry, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Nothing you could have done, nothing, would have justified the way they treated you. Accidental magic is normal for magical children. Most wizarding families understand that and help their children learn control. What the Dursleys did to you was not normal, not acceptable, and not your fault. Harry stared at her for a long moment, tears gathering in his eyes despite his efforts to maintain control. The kindness in her voice was almost harder to bear than the cruelty he was used to. But Professor Dumbledore said I had to stay there. He said it was for my protection. Professor Dumbledore, Madame Clearwater said carefully, may have had his reasons for that placement, but those reasons don't change what happened to you. You deserved to be protected and cared for, Harry. You deserved to feel safe and loved. And I'm sorry, I'm so very sorry, that no one ensured you had those things. That was when Harry finally broke. 15 years of carefully suppressed pain came pouring out in great, shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. He cried for the child who had carved his name into the wall of a cupboard, who had foraged for food scraps in his own garden, who had learned to hide his most treasured possessions, because even in his own room, nothing was truly his. Madame Clearwater didn't try to stop his tears or offer empty platitudes. She simply conjured a box of tissues and waited, her presence steady and comforting, while Harry grieved for a childhood he had never been allowed to have. When the sobs finally subsided, Harry felt emptied out, but somehow lighter, as though a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted from his shoulders. What happens now? He asked. Now, Madame Clearwater said, we make sure you're safe. We make sure you get the care and protection you should have had from the beginning. And Harry? She waited until he met her eyes. You're not going back to Privet Drive. Not ever. Madame Bones has made that very clear. Back in her office, Amelia was reviewing the preliminary evidence with a team of legal experts from the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, trying to understand the intricacies of blood protection magic and whether alternative arrangements could have provided adequate security. The theory is sound, acknowledged Hermione Clearwater, the Ministry's senior expert on protective enchantments. Blood protection based on sacrificial magic is indeed powerful, but the implementation— She frowned at the documents spread across Amelia's desk. There are several concerning aspects to how this protection was established and maintained. Such as, the protection requires the blood relative to willingly accept the child as family. If the Dursleys genuinely despised Harry, if they saw him as a burden or a threat rather than someone deserving of care, then the protection would be significantly weakened. Love, or at least acceptance, isn't just a nice addition to the magic. It's a necessary component. Amelia felt a chill run down her spine. Are you saying that if the Dursleys truly hated Harry, the protection might not have been working at all? I'm saying that the protection would have been compromised from the beginning. And there are other issues. Hermione pulled out a thick volume of magical lore. Alternative protection methods exist that would have provided equal or superior security. The Fidelius charm, for instance, or placement with a wizarding family under protected ward conditions. The blood protection wasn't the only option available. Then why was it chosen? Hermione exchanged glances with her colleagues, clearly uncomfortable with the implications of the question. I couldn't say without examining Professor Dumbledore's reasoning directly. But from a purely technical standpoint, the blood protection had one advantage that the other methods didn't. Which was? It was the only protection that required Harry to return to an abusive situation annually. The other methods would have allowed him to be placed with a loving, supportive family while maintaining adequate security. Hermione's voice was carefully neutral, but her meaning was clear. The implications hit Amelia like a physical blow. If Dumbledore had chosen the blood protection specifically because it required Harry to endure abuse, then everything about his decision-making process needed to be questioned. The protection hadn't been chosen because it was the best option for Harry's safety. It had been chosen because it served some other purpose entirely. "Thank you, Hermione," Amelia said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her mind. "I'll need a formal report documenting these findings, and I'll need recommendations for alternative protection methods that could be implemented immediately." After the legal experts left, Amelia sat alone with the evidence that was mounting into an indictment of everyone who had been responsible for Harry's welfare. The witness testimony from his neighbours painted a picture of systematic abuse that had been visible to anyone who cared to look. The physical evidence from his home showed deliberate confinement and deprivation. The medical examination revealed years of untreated injuries and malnutrition, and now the legal analysis suggested that the protection used to justify his placement had been deliberately chosen to ensure his continued suffering. A knock at her door interrupted her dark thoughts. "Come in." Cornelius Fudge entered her office, but he wasn't alone. Behind him came Lucius Malfoy, his platinum hair perfectly styled, and his expression radiating aristocratic disdain. Amelia felt her blood pressure rise at the sight of the two men. If Fudge was bringing Malfoy to pressure her, then the political stakes of her investigation were even higher than she had realized. "Amelia," Fudge began, his voice carrying forced joviality that fooled no one. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but Mr. Malfoy has some concerns about this investigation of yours that I felt you should hear directly." Malfoy stepped forward, his walking stick clicking against the floor with each measured step. "Madam Bones, I understand you've opened an investigation into Professor Dumbledore's handling of the Potter boys' placement. As a concerned member of the Hogwarts Board of Governors, I felt I should express my reservations about this course of action." "Your reservations are noted, Mr. Malfoy," Amelia replied coolly. "However, the DMLE's investigation into child welfare concerns doesn't require approval from the Hogwarts Board of Governors." "Perhaps not," Malfoy conceded, his smile sharp and unpleasant. "But surely you understand the broader implications of what you're doing. Professor Dumbledore's reputation is one of the pillars of our society's stability. Undermining public confidence in his judgment could have unfortunate consequences for all of us." Amelia studied the man before her, noting the careful way he had phrased his words. This wasn't a direct threat. Malfoy was too sophisticated for that, but it was clearly meant to be intimidating. "Mr. Malfoy, are you suggesting that protecting a child from abuse is less important than protecting someone's reputation?" "I'm suggesting that sometimes individual cases must be weighed against broader societal needs," Malfoy replied smoothly. "The Potter boy has survived his experiences, has he not? He's alive, healthy, and by all accounts remarkably capable. Perhaps the ends have justified the means. The words hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. Amelia felt a cold rage building in her chest, the kind of fury that came from confronting people who viewed children as expendable pawns in larger games. "Mr. Malfoy," she said, her voice deadly quiet, "if you're suggesting that child abuse is acceptable as long as the child survives it, then I think we have fundamentally different views on the value of human life." Fudge shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that his attempt to pressure Amelia was backfiring spectacularly. Now, let's not get carried away. I'm sure Mr. Malfoy didn't mean—" "I meant precisely what I said," Malfoy interrupted, his mask of civility slipping slightly. "Some children are important enough that their comfort becomes secondary to their survival. The Potter boy's discomfort has ensured his continued existence. That should be considered a success by any reasonable measure." Amelia stood slowly, drawing on every ounce of authority she had accumulated over her career. "Get out of my office, both of you. This investigation will continue according to the evidence, not according to the political convenience of Death Eaters and their sympathizers." The word struck Malfoy like a slap across the face. His composure cracked completely, revealing the cold fury beneath his aristocratic facade. "You forget yourself, Madam Bones. There are forces in our world more powerful than your department's authority." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Malfoy?" For a moment, the two faced each other across her desk, the air thick with tension. Then Malfoy stepped back, his expression returning to its usual mask of disdain. "I'm simply observing that investigations sometimes encounter obstacles when they stray into areas that are better left undisturbed. Good day, Madam Bones." After they left, Amelia sat back down, her hands shaking slightly with suppressed fury. The investigation had clearly touched a nerve that extended far beyond Dumbledore's personal reputation. If Lucius Malfoy was involved in pressuring her to drop the case, then there were political implications she hadn't yet considered. She reached for her quill and began writing a memo to her security detail. If Death Eaters were taking an interest in her investigation, then Harry wasn't the only one who might need protection. At Hogwarts, Susan Bones found Harry sitting alone by the lake, staring out at the water with the sort of vacant expression that suggested his mind was somewhere else entirely. She had been looking for him since dinner, worried about what her aunt's investigation might be uncovering and how Harry was handling the scrutiny. "Mind if I sit?" she asked gently. Harry looked up, seeming to focus on her with some effort. "Sure." His voice was hoarse, as though he had been crying, and Susan felt her heart ache with sympathy. "Rough day?" she asked, settling beside him on the grass. Harry laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You could say that. Your aunt had me examined by a healer today, asked me a lot of questions about—" He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. "About how you've been treated at home," Susan said softly. "Yeah." Harry picked up a stone and threw it into the lake, watching the ripples spread across the surface. "I told her things I've never told anyone, things I promised myself I'd never talk about." Susan studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw and the way his hands clenched and unclenched in his lap. "How do you feel about that?" "Terrified," Harry admitted. "For 15 years, keeping quiet was how I stayed safe. Well, as safe as possible. And now," he gestured helplessly, "now everyone's going to know. The whole wizarding world is going to know that Harry Potter, the boy who lived, spent his childhood being beaten by his Muggle relatives." "Harry," Susan said carefully, "you know that what happened to you wasn't your fault, right? You know that the way they treated you says nothing about your worth as a person?" Harry was quiet for so long that Susan wondered if he was going to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I keep telling myself that. The healer said the same thing. But it's hard to believe when you've spent your whole life being told you're worthless." Susan felt tears prick at her eyes. She thought about her own childhood, about the unquestioned love and support she had received from her family, and tried to imagine what it would have been like to grow up believing she was fundamentally undeserving of care. "You're not worthless," she said fiercely. "You're brave and kind and selfless, sometimes to a fault. You've saved people's lives, Harry. You've saved the whole wizarding world more times than anyone our age should have had to. And more than that, more than any of the heroic things you've done. You're a good person. The fact that you survived what you did and still came out caring about others, still willing to help people even when no one helped you. That's extraordinary." Harry turned to look at her, his green eyes bright with unshed tears. "Do you really believe that?" "I believe it absolutely," Susan said without hesitation. "And my aunt believes it too. That's why she's fighting for you, even when powerful people are trying to stop her. Because you matter, Harry. Not because you're famous, not because you're useful in some war, but because you're a person who deserves to be protected and cared for." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set over the lake, the water turning gold and crimson in the evening light. For the first time in his life, Harry allowed himself to consider the possibility that Susan was right, that he might actually deserve the care and protection that other people took for granted. "Susan," he said finally. "Yeah? Thank you for being my friend, for caring about what happens to me. I don't know if I ever properly thanked you for that." Susan smiled, bumping his shoulder gently with hers. "You don't need to thank me for caring about you, Harry. That's what friends do." As they walked back to the castle together, Susan made a mental note to write to her aunt that evening. Whatever evidence the investigation was uncovering, whatever pressure was being applied to stop it, Harry needed to know that there were people who would fight for him. People who saw his worth not as a weapon or a symbol, but as a person who deserved love and safety, and the chance to simply be young. The investigation was far from over, but already it had accomplished something important. It had shown Harry Potter that his life had value beyond his usefulness to others, and for someone who had spent 15 years believing otherwise, that revelation was worth fighting for. Chapter 4. The Weight of Truth. Harry woke from the dream with his heart hammering against his ribs and the taste of copper in his mouth. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was. The dormitory around him felt foreign, too safe, too quiet. In the dream, he had been 7 again, locked in the cupboard while Uncle Vernon's voice thundered through the door, promising consequences that would make him wish he'd never been born. But it wasn't a dream. Not really. It was a memory, one of hundreds that had been clawing their way to the surface ever since his conversation with Madame Clearwater. The healer's gentle questions had opened something in his mind that he had spent years keeping carefully sealed, and now the past was bleeding through in vivid, unwanted detail. He sat up slowly, pressing his hands against his eyes until stars burst behind his eyelids. Around him, his doormates slept peacefully, their breathing soft and even in the darkness. Ron was snoring gently in the bed next to his, one arm hanging over the side of the mattress. For a moment, Harry felt a sharp stab of envy. What would it be like to sleep without fear, to wake without that moment of disorientation where he forgot he was safe? The answer came to him with bitter clarity. He would never know. Even if he never returned to Privet Drive, even if the investigation resulted in justice and protection and all the things Madame Bones had promised him, the damage was already done. 15 years of conditioning couldn't be undone with good intentions and medical examinations. He slipped out of bed and padded to the window, looking out at the grounds where morning mist was beginning to gather around the lake. Somewhere out there, Susan Bones was probably sleeping peacefully in her own bed, surrounded by the kind of love and security he had never known. The thought didn't make him bitter, not exactly, but it highlighted the vast distance between his experience and that of his peers. A soft rustling behind him made him turn. Ron was sitting up, his red hair sticking up at impossible angles, squinting in Harry's direction. "Harry? You all right, mate?" Harry considered lying, telling Ron to go back to sleep, pretending that everything was fine. It was what he had always done before, the careful performance of normalcy that had kept his secrets safe. But after yesterday's revelations, the effort of maintaining that facade felt exhausting. "Couldn't sleep," he said simply. Ron swung his legs out of bed, automatically reaching for his wand to cast a quiet Lumos charm. The soft light revealed the concern on his face, the way he studied Harry's expression with growing alarm. "You look awful. Worse than usual, I mean." Ron's attempt at humor fell flat when Harry didn't even try to smile. "Ron," Harry said slowly, "what do you know about my relatives, about how I spend my summers?" The question seemed to catch Ron off guard. He rubbed his eyes, clearly trying to focus on a conversation that felt too serious for 4 in the morning. "Not much, I suppose. You don't really talk about them. They're muggles, right? Don't like magic much?" He paused, studying Harry's face more carefully. "Why? What's this about?" Harry sat down on his own bed, facing Ron across the narrow space between their mattresses. "The DMLE is investigating them. My placement with them. They think—" He swallowed hard, the word still difficult to say aloud. "They think I've been abused." Ron's expression went through several rapid changes, confusion, disbelief, and finally a dawning horror that made Harry's stomach clench. "Abused?" "Harry, that's—" Ron stopped, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled for words. "Are you saying they've been hurting you?" "Yeah," Harry said quietly. "For years. Since I was small." The silence that followed was deafening. Ron stared at him with an expression of such shock and dismay that Harry almost regretted bringing it up. But there was something liberating about saying the words out loud, about watching someone else process the reality he had been living with for so long. "Bloody hell," Ron whispered finally. "Harry, why didn't you ever say anything? We're supposed to be best mates. We tell each other everything." The accusation in Ron's voice stung, even though Harry understood it. "Because," he said carefully, "I thought it was normal. Or at least, I thought it was normal for me. I thought I deserved it." Ron's face went white. "Deserved it? Harry, how could you think—" He stopped, running his hands through his hair in agitation. "God, no wonder you never wanted to talk about home. No wonder you were always so quiet at the beginning of term." Harry watched his friend struggle with the implications of what he had revealed, seeing the exact moment when Ron began to reconsider every conversation they'd had, every summer holiday, when Harry had deflected questions about his life away from Hogwarts. It was painful to witness, but necessary. If their friendship was going to survive this revelation, it needed to be built on truth rather than careful omissions. "The thing is," Harry continued, "I don't know how to be around people who haven't been hurt. I don't know how to accept kindness without waiting for the punishment that's supposed to come after. And I don't know how to trust that people care about me for myself, rather than for what I can do for them." Ron was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his hands. When he looked up, his blue eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Harry, mate, we do care about you. Hermione and me, we've always cared about you. Not because you're famous or because you're useful, but because you're our friend. Our best friend." "I know," Harry said, and was surprised to find that he meant it. "I know you do. But knowing it and believing it, those are different things." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky outside began to lighten, each lost in their own thoughts. Harry found himself thinking about Susan's words by the lake, about her certainty that he deserved care and protection. Maybe, with enough time and patience, he could learn to believe it too. "Harry," Ron said eventually, "I want you to know something. Whatever happens with this investigation, Whatever comes out, you've got a place with our family. Mum's been saying it for years. You're one of her sons now, whether you like it or not. And if you need somewhere safe to go." He shrugged, the gesture somehow conveying more than words could have. Harry felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you," he managed. That means more than you know." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the Gryffindor common room. Hermione appeared at breakfast looking haggard and determined, her usually perfect hair escaping from its braid and her robes wrinkled as though she had slept in them. She made a beeline for Harry and Ron's table, her expression grim. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. "All of us. Privately." Harry felt his stomach drop. Hermione's tone suggested that she had learned something significant, and given the current state of his life, significant revelations were rarely good news. They found an empty classroom on the second floor, warding the door against interruption, before settling into the uncomfortable wooden chairs. "I know about the investigation," Hermione said immediately, her eyes fixed on Harry with an intensity that made him want to look away. "I have contacts in the ministry through my parents' work, and word is spreading. Harry, they're saying—" She stopped, her composure cracking slightly. "They're saying you've been systematically abused by your relatives for years." Harry nodded slowly, unsurprised that Hermione had found out. She had always been the most resourceful of their trio, the most likely to uncover information that others missed. "It's true," he said simply. Hermione's face crumpled. "Oh, Harry, I should have known. I should have seen the signs." Tears were streaming down her cheeks now, and her voice was thick with self-recrimination. "All those times you came back to school too thin, too quiet. All those times you deflected questions about your summer. How could I have been so blind?" "You weren't blind," Harry said firmly. "I was hiding it. I got very good at hiding it over the years." "But I'm supposed to be observant," Hermione protested. "I notice everything else. I research everything else. How did I miss something so important happening to one of my best friends?" Ron shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We all missed it, Hermione. And maybe that's because Harry didn't want us to see it. Maybe he was protecting us from something we weren't ready to handle." Harry looked between his two friends, seeing the guilt and pain in their faces, and felt a familiar stab of responsibility for their distress. It was an old pattern, one that ran so deep he barely recognized it as learned behavior. When the people around him were upset, his first instinct was to make it better, to take the blame, to minimize his own suffering, so that they could feel less guilty about not preventing it. But Madame Clearwater's words echoed in his mind. "You were not responsible for what they did to you. You were a child." "Stop," he said quietly, and both of his friends looked at him in surprise. "Stop blaming yourselves for something you couldn't have prevented. I was the one living it. And even I didn't fully understand that it was wrong until recently. You can't blame yourself for not recognizing something I didn't recognize myself." Hermione wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving smudges on her cheeks. "But we should have helped you. We should have done something." "You did help me," Harry said with more conviction than he felt. "Both of you. You gave me friendship and loyalty and a place where I could be myself. You made Hogwarts feel like home. That's not nothing, Hermione. That's everything." For a moment they sat in silence, the weight of Harry's words settling over them like a blanket. Then Hermione straightened her shoulders, her expression shifting from guilt to determination. "What can we do now? How can we help with the investigation?" Harry was about to answer when a sharp knock echoed through the classroom. They exchanged worried glances before Harry moved to open the door, revealing Professor McGonagall's stern face. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Harry could see tension around her eyes that suggested she was struggling with strong emotions. "Mr. Potter," she said formally, "you're needed in the headmaster's office. Immediately." Harry felt his blood turn cold. He hadn't spoken to Dumbledore since the night of his hearing, hadn't seen the headmaster since returning to school. The prospect of facing him now with everything that had been revealed about his placement and protection, filled Harry with a dread that was almost physical. "Is something wrong, Professor?" Hermione asked, her voice carefully controlled. McGonagall's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. "That remains to be seen, Miss Granger. Mr. Potter, if you would come with me." The walk to the headmaster's office felt like a march to execution. Harry's mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Had Dumbledore found a way to stop the investigation? Was he being summoned to explain his cooperation with the DMLE? Or was this something else, entirely? Some new crisis that would once again require Harry's involvement, regardless of his own wishes. The gargoyle stepped aside at McGonagall's password, and they ascended the spiral staircase in tense silence. McGonagall knocked once, before opening the door to the circular office, her expression unreadable. Dumbledore sat behind his desk, but he wasn't alone. Amelia Bones stood near the window, her posture rigid with barely contained anger. Between them sat a woman Harry didn't recognize, middle-aged, with greying hair pulled back in a severe bun, and robes that suggested ministry authority. "Ah, Harry," Dumbledore said, his voice carrying its usual gentle warmth. "Please sit down. I believe you know Madam Bones, and this is Madam Clearwater from the Department for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures." Harry remained standing, his instincts screaming that sitting would put him at a disadvantage. "What's this about?" Amelia stepped forward, her expression softening when she looked at him. "Harry, we need to ask you some questions about your time at Hogwarts. Specifically, about your condition when you return each year after spending the summer with your relatives." The pieces clicked together in Harry's mind. They were expanding the investigation, looking into whether anyone at Hogwarts had noticed signs of abuse and failed to act on them. His gaze flicked to Dumbledore, whose blue eyes were watching him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "What kind of questions?" Harry asked carefully. "Questions about your health, your behavior, any injuries you may have sustained during your summers away from school," Madam Clearwater explained. "We're trying to establish a pattern of evidence to determine whether proper procedures were followed when concerns about your welfare should have been raised." Harry felt trapped between competing loyalties. On one hand, he wanted to cooperate with the investigation, to see justice done for the child he had been. On the other hand, answering their questions would implicate people at Hogwarts who had shown him kindness, who had done their best within a system that was fundamentally flawed. "Harry," Dumbledore said softly, "I want you to know that you should feel free to answer honestly. We all want what's best for you." The words were meant to be reassuring, but they had the opposite effect. Harry looked at the headmaster, this man who had placed him with the Dursleys, who had known about the Horcrux in his scar, who had orchestrated so much of his life from the shadows, and felt a cold anger settle in his chest. "Do you?" Harry asked quietly. "Do you really want what's best for me, Professor? Or do you want what's most convenient for your war strategy?" The silence that followed was deafening. Dumbledore's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes that might have been pain or guilt. Amelia and Madam Clearwater exchanged meaningful glances, clearly recognizing the implications of Harry's question. "Harry," Dumbledore said carefully, "I understand that you're angry." "I'm not angry," Harry interrupted, his voice still eerily calm. "I'm just tired of pretending that the people who were supposed to protect me actually had my best interests at heart." Meanwhile, in the Ministry of Magic, Rita Skeeter was having the best day of her professional career. The tip had come from a source within the DMLE, someone who understood the value of information and wasn't above supplementing their ministry salary with payments from enterprising journalists. The details were scandalous beyond her wildest dreams. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, systematically abused by his Muggle relatives, while Albus Dumbledore turned a blind eye. Rita adjusted her jeweled spectacles and read through her notes again, savoring each delicious revelation. Physical abuse, documented by ministry healers. witness testimony from neighbors describing years of neglect and cruelty, evidence of deliberate confinement and starvation, and at the center of it all, the uncomfortable question of how much Dumbledore had known, and when he had known it. She glanced at her quick quotes quill, which was already trembling with anticipation on her desk. The story practically wrote itself. The boy who suffered. Harry Potter's secret nightmare exposed. She could see the headlines now, could imagine the public's reaction when they learned that their beloved hero had spent his childhood as a victim of systematic abuse. But there was more to this story than just sensationalism, though Rita was never one to overlook the commercial potential of human suffering. There were political implications that could reshape the entire wizarding establishment. If Dumbledore's judgment on Harry's placement was this catastrophically wrong, what else had he mishandled? How many other decisions had been made with similar disregard for human cost? Rita reached for her quill and began to write, her words flowing with the practiced ease of someone who had built a career on other people's pain. But even she, hardened by years of scandal and sensation, found herself disturbed by the scope of what she was documenting. This wasn't just a story about a famous child who had suffered. It was an indictment of an entire system that had failed in its most basic responsibility to protect the innocent. Back at Hogwarts, Harry was finishing his uncomfortable interview when a house elf appeared in Dumbledore's office with a crack that made everyone jump. The elf was trembling with agitation, wringing its hands as it delivered a message that made Amelia's face go white. "Madam Bones," the elf squeaked, "you must return to the ministry immediately. The prophet has the story. They're printing tomorrow morning." The room erupted into controlled chaos. Amelia was already moving toward the fireplace, her expression grim with determination. Madame Clearwater was gathering her papers with efficient speed. Only Dumbledore remained seated, his hands folded calmly in his lap, despite the crisis unfolding around him. "Harry," Amelia said, as she reached for a handful of flu powder, "I want you to know that this changes nothing about the investigation. In fact, it may help us. Public attention will make it much harder for anyone to interfere with the process." Harry nodded, though he felt anything but reassured. Public attention meant scrutiny, meant questions, meant the entire wizarding world examining his private pain under a microscope. It was his worst nightmare made manifest, the ultimate loss of the privacy he had fought so hard to maintain. After the ministry officials left, Harry found himself alone with Dumbledore for the first time since learning the full scope of the headmaster's manipulations. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken accusations and long overdue reckonings. "Harry," Dumbledore said finally, "I want you to understand that everything I have done, every decision I have made regarding your placement and protection, has been motivated by my desire to keep you alive and safe." Harry looked at the man who had shaped so much of his life from the shadows, this figure who had been simultaneously his greatest protector and his most sophisticated tormentor. "Safe," he repeated flatly. "Is that what you call 15 years of systematic abuse? Safety? The protection afforded by your mother's sacrifice could have been achieved through other means," Harry interrupted. "I've read the reports, Professor. I know that there were alternatives. Better alternatives. You chose to place me with people who would hurt me because you thought it would make me more willing to die for your cause when the time came." Dumbledore's composure cracked slightly, revealing something that might have been genuine remorse. "Harry, you must understand." "I understand perfectly," Harry said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "I understand that you've been grooming me for sacrifice since I was a baby. I understand that every kindness, every piece of guidance, every moment of seeming care has been calculated to make me more willing to give up my life when you decide it's necessary." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Dumbledore aged before Harry's eyes, the weight of his choices settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I had hoped you would never have to know. I had hoped to spare you that knowledge until—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Until it was time for me to die," Harry completed. "Until you had squeezed every ounce of usefulness out of me and could finally dispose of the inconvenient child you've been managing all these years." Dumbledore flinched, as though Harry had struck him. "It was never supposed to be like this. The choices I made, they seemed like the only options available at the time." "They were the only options you were willing to consider," Harry corrected. "The only ones that served your larger strategy. But they were never the only options that existed." Harry turned toward the door, then paused, looking back at the man who had controlled so much of his life from the shadows. "I want you to know something, Professor. Whatever happens with this investigation, whatever the public learns about what you've done, I'm not going to sacrifice myself for your war. I'm not going to die quietly and conveniently when you decide it's time. I'm going to live, and I'm going to make sure that no other child goes through what I went through in the name of the greater good." He left the headmaster's office without waiting for a response, his heart pounding with the exhilaration of finally speaking truth to power. For the first time in his life, he had stood up to Albus Dumbledore and meant every word he had said. The next morning brought chaos to Hogwarts in the form of the Daily Prophet's morning edition. Students clustered around copies of the paper, their voices rising in excited whispers as they read the explosive headline, "The Boy Who Suffered. Ministry Investigation Reveals Harry Potter's Secret Nightmare." Harry sat at the Gryffindor table, staring down at his untouched breakfast, while the storm of speculation swirled around him. Rita Skeeter's article was everything he had feared it would be: sensational, invasive, and surprisingly accurate. She had somehow obtained details about his medical examination, quotes from unnamed sources within the DMLE, and enough specifics about his treatment at Privet Drive to make it clear that her information was genuine. "Harry," Hermione said softly, sliding into the seat beside him. "Are you all right?" He looked up to find the great hall staring at him with a mixture of curiosity, sympathy, and uncomfortable fascination. Some students were openly gawking, others whispered behind their hands, and a few looked at him with the sort of pity that made his skin crawl. This was exactly what he had been trying to avoid, becoming an object of public fascination and sympathy rather than a person deserving of basic dignity. "No," he said quietly. "I'm really not." Ron appeared on his other side, his face flushed with anger. "The whole thing's rubbish," he declared loudly enough for nearby students to hear. "People acting like Harry's some kind of circus attraction just because he's had a rough time of it. As if they wouldn't want their privacy respected if it was them." The pointed comment had its intended effect. Several students looked away guiltily, and the volume of whispered conversations dropped noticeably. Harry felt a rush of gratitude for Ron's protective instincts, even as he recognized that his friend's intervention was just one more reminder of how different he was from his peers. A commotion at the head table drew his attention. Professor McGonagall was engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with Professor Snape, while Dumbledore sat between them, looking older and more frail than Harry had ever seen him. Other faculty members were huddled over their own copies of the Prophet, their expressions ranging from shock to concern to what might have been guilt. "Mr. Potter," came a familiar voice from behind him. Harry turned to see Professor McGonagall approaching, her expression stern but not unkind. "The headmaster would like to see you in his office." Harry's first instinct was to refuse. He had said everything he needed to say to Dumbledore the previous day, and he had no desire to submit to further manipulation or emotional blackmail. But before he could speak, McGonagall leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It's not about the investigation, Mr. Potter. There's been a development. Your aunt and uncle are here." The words hit Harry like a physical blow. The Dursleys were at Hogwarts, which could only mean one thing. They had seen the Prophet article and come to— what? Deny the allegations? Demand he recant his testimony? The possibilities raced through his mind, each one worse than the last. "I don't want to see them," Harry said quickly. McGonagall's expression softened slightly. "I understand your reluctance, but they're making quite a scene. They're demanding to see you, claiming that the allegations are fabricated and that they've been slandered in the press. The headmaster feels it would be best to resolve this matter quickly and quietly." Harry looked around the great hall, noting how every conversation had stopped and every eye was fixed on him and McGonagall. The prospect of a public confrontation with the Dursleys was even worse than a private one. At least in Dumbledore's office, he would have some measure of control over the situation. "All right," he said reluctantly, "but I want Madam Bones there, and I want Ron and Hermione to come with me." McGonagall nodded. "I believe Madam Bones is already on her way. As for your friends—" She glanced around the hall at the sea of curious faces. "Yes, I think that would be wise." The walk to the headmaster's office felt like a funeral procession. Students lined the corridors, watching Harry pass with expressions that ranged from sympathy to morbid fascination. He kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge the stares, but he could feel the weight of their attention, like a physical pressure against his skin. The scene in Dumbledore's office was exactly as chaotic as Harry had expected. Vernon Dursley was red-faced and shouting, his massive bulk filling one of the chairs while he gestured angrily at a copy of the Prophet. Petunia sat beside him, her face pinched with fury and what might have been fear. Dudley lurked near the door, looking uncomfortable and out of place in the magical environment. "This is slander," Vernon was bellowing. "Outright lies and fabrications designed to destroy our reputation. That boy has always been trouble, always been a liar, and now he's finally found people gullible enough to believe his stories." Harry felt the familiar clench of fear in his stomach, the conditioned response to Vernon's raised voice and threatening posture. But this time he wasn't alone. Ron and Hermione flanked him, their presence a reminder that he had allies now. And Amelia Bones stood near Dumbledore's desk, her expression coldly professional as she observed the Dursleys' performance. "Mr. Dursley," Amelia said, her voice cutting through Vernon's tirade like a knife. "I'm Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. I understand you have concerns about our investigation into Harry's welfare." Vernon turned his attention to Amelia, his face growing even redder. "Concerns? I have more than concerns, lady. You've got no right to interfere in family matters, no right to spread lies about decent people trying to do their duty by an ungrateful child." "Duty?" Harry spoke for the first time since entering the office, his voice quiet but carrying clearly. "Is that what you call it? Locking me in my room for days at a time? Starving me? Beating me whenever I did something you didn't like?" Vernon's expression shifted to something approaching panic. "You little liar. We fed you. We clothed you. We kept a roof over your head when no one else would have you. If you got disciplined occasionally, it was because you were a troublemaker who wouldn't follow the rules." "Troublemaker," Harry repeated, his voice growing stronger. "I was 7 years old when you first hit me with your belt. What could a 7-year-old possibly have done to deserve that? You set fire to the kitchen." Petunia spoke for the first time, her voice shrill with defensiveness. "You could have burned down the house. Someone had to teach you that actions have consequences." "I had a nightmare, and my magic reacted," Harry replied evenly. "Something that's completely normal for magical children. Something any responsible guardian would have understood and helped me manage instead of punishing me for." Amelia stepped forward, her presence commanding attention from everyone in the room. "Mr. and Mrs. Dursley, I want to make something very clear. We have extensive evidence of the abuse Harry suffered in your care. Witness testimony from neighbors, physical evidence from your home, medical documentation of his injuries. This is not a matter of opinion or interpretation, it's a matter of documented fact." Vernon's bluster faltered slightly. "Evidence? What evidence? You can't prove anything?" Magical examination of your house revealed traces of confinement spells, locks designed to keep someone imprisoned rather than protect them from intruders. We have photographs of the cupboard under the stairs where Harry lived for his first 11 years, complete with scratches on the walls where a young child carved his own name and age. Amelia's voice was deadly calm. We have medical records showing 17 separate bone fractures, multiple untreated concussions, and chronic malnutrition consistent with systematic starvation. The silence that followed was deafening. Vernon's face had gone from red to pale, while Petunia sat frozen in her chair, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Dudley shifted uncomfortably by the door, his eyes fixed on the floor. Furthermore, Amelia continued, we have Harry's own testimony about the specific nature of the abuse he suffered. Testimony that has been given under veritaserum and verified by trained interrogators. Harry felt a shock run through him. He hadn't been given veritaserum, he would have remembered that. But Amelia caught his eye and gave him the slightest nod, a signal that she was bluffing for strategic effect. That's not possible, Vernon stammered. He's lying. He's always been a liar. Mr. Dursley, Dumbledore spoke for the first time since the Dursleys had arrived, his voice heavy with something that might have been regret. I think it would be best if you ceased this line of defense. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and your continued denials only make your situation worse. Vernon turned on Dumbledore with renewed fury. This is all your fault. You're the one who dumped him on our doorstep with that ridiculous letter. You told us he was our responsibility, that we had to take him in. You never said anything about investigations or consequences or any of this rubbish. Harry watched the exchange with growing amazement. For 15 years, the Dursleys had held absolute power over him, had been the arbiters of his worth and the architects of his suffering. But here, in this room filled with magical authority figures, they looked small and petty and ultimately powerless. Actually, Amelia said, consulting a folder she had brought with her. According to our records, Professor Dumbledore's letter specifically stated that Harry was to be treated as family, with love and care appropriate for a child who had already suffered tremendous trauma. It also mentioned that his welfare would be monitored to ensure his safety and well-being. She looked up at the Dursleys with an expression of cold disdain. Clearly, none of those conditions were met. Petunia finally found her voice again, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. We did our best. We didn't know how to handle a magical child. We were scared. Being scared doesn't excuse 15 years of systematic abuse, Harry said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. Being scared doesn't justify treating a child like he's less than human. For the first time since he could remember, Harry looked at his relatives without fear. They couldn't hurt him anymore. They had no power over him, no authority to determine his worth or his future. They were just 3 people who had chosen cruelty over compassion, fear over understanding, and they would finally face consequences for those choices. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley, Amelia said formally, you are hereby informed that Harry Potter is being removed from your custody permanently. Furthermore, the DMLE will be filing charges against you for child abuse, neglect, and endangerment. You will be contacted by our legal department regarding the specific charges and the procedures for your trial. Vernon surged to his feet, his massive frame towering over everyone else in the room. You can't do this. He's family. He's our responsibility. He was never your family, Harry said quietly, but his words carried clearly through the room. Family doesn't hurt each other. Family doesn't treat each other like burdens or freaks or inconveniences. You had 15 years to learn that, and you chose not to. The Dursleys left Hogwarts in disgrace, escorted by ministry officials who made it clear that their cooperation with the ongoing investigation was not optional. Harry watched them go from the window of Dumbledore's office, feeling a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and something that might have been closure. How do you feel? Hermione asked softly, moving to stand beside him at the window. Harry considered the question seriously. "Free," he said finally. "Scared, but free." That afternoon, Harry found himself at the Bones family home for the first time, sitting in a kitchen that radiated warmth and security in a way that Privet Drive never had. Susan's mother, a kind woman with greying hair and laugh lines around her eyes, had greeted him with a hug that felt genuinely welcoming rather than obligatory. "You must be Harry," she had said, holding him at arm's length to study his face with maternal assessment. "Susan's told me so much about you. I'm so glad you're finally safe, dear." The word safe still felt foreign to Harry, like a concept he understood intellectually, but couldn't quite internalize. But sitting at the Bones family kitchen table, watching Susan help her mother prepare dinner while chattering about her day at school, he began to understand what safety might actually feel like. "Harry," Susan's mother said, setting a steaming mug of cocoa in front of him, "Amelia tells me you'll be staying with us for a while. I want you to know that this isn't charity or obligation. You're welcome here for as long as you need, and we're genuinely happy to have you." Harry wrapped his hands around the warm mug, using the heat to ground himself in the present moment. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I don't really know how to. I've never had a normal family situation before." Susan's mother smiled, her expression gentle but not pitying. "Well, then, it's a good thing we have plenty of time to figure it out together. And Harry, there's no pressure to be anything other than exactly who you are. You don't have to earn your place here or prove that you deserve care. You just have to let us care about you." Later that evening, as Harry settled into a bedroom that was his, without conditions or threats, he reflected on how much his world had changed in just a few weeks. The investigation had stripped away the careful facades that had protected him, had exposed his pain to public scrutiny, had forced him to confront truths about his past that he had spent years avoiding. But it had also given him something he had never had before: choice. The choice to tell his own story, to demand better treatment, to refuse the role of willing victim that others had assigned to him. The choice to live for himself rather than die for someone else's cause. As he drifted off to sleep, in a bed that felt safe and warm and unquestionably his own, Harry allowed himself to imagine a future where he wasn't defined by his suffering or his usefulness to others. A future where he could simply be Harry Potter, not the boy who lived, not the chosen one, not the sacrificial lamb, just a young man trying to figure out who he was when he wasn't being hurt or manipulated or used. It was a foreign concept, but for the first time in his life, it felt possible. Chapter 5. Resistance and Revelation. The emergency meeting of the Order of the Phoenix convened in the kitchen of Grimmauld Place at precisely midnight, the usual precautions doubled in light of recent events. Albus Dumbledore sat at the head of the scarred wooden table, his usually serene demeanour replaced by something approaching desperation. The Daily Prophet's morning edition lay spread before him, Rita Skeeter's damning exposé highlighted in harsh yellow light from the overhead fixtures. Around the table, familiar faces bore expressions of confusion, concern, and in some cases, growing suspicion. Molly Weasley clutched a handkerchief, her eyes red from crying over the revelations about Harry's treatment. Arthur sat beside her, his usual genial expression replaced by something harder, more calculating. Remus Lupin stared down at his hands, while Sirius Black paced behind his chair like a caged animal. "I've called this meeting," Dumbledore began, his voice carrying its usual gentle authority despite the strain visible in his face, to address the regrettable situation that has developed regarding Harry's welfare investigation. "I believe we can all agree that certain misunderstandings have been allowed to spiral out of control." "Misunderstandings?" Sirius stopped pacing, his voice sharp with barely contained fury. "Albus, they're saying Harry was systematically abused for 15 years while you knew about it. They're saying you placed him there deliberately because you thought it would make him more willing to die for your cause. Dumbledore's blue eyes dimmed slightly behind his half-moon spectacles. The situation is more complex than the press would have you believe, Sirius. The protection afforded by Lily's sacrifice required specific conditions to maintain its effectiveness. Harry's placement with the Dursleys, while difficult, was necessary to preserve the magic that kept him alive. Necessary. Remus spoke for the first time since arriving, his voice hollow with something that might have been grief or betrayal. You're saying it was necessary for Harry to be beaten and starved and treated like an unwanted animal? I'm saying that the alternative was his death, Dumbledore replied, but there was something in his tone that suggested he no longer fully believed his own words. The blood protection required love, Molly interrupted, her voice crackling with maternal fury. Love and willing acceptance. How could you possibly think the Dursleys loved Harry when they treated him like a burden from the very beginning? Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, studying the faces around the table. These people had followed him through 2 wars, had trusted him with their lives and the lives of their children. Now, for the first time, that trust was wavering, and he could see the doubt growing in their eyes like a cancer. The magic was imperfect, he admitted finally. The protection was compromised from early on, yes, but it still provided some measure of security, and more importantly, it ensured that Harry would grow up away from the temptations of fame and power that might have corrupted him. So you admit it, Arthur said, his voice deadly quiet. You knew the protection wasn't working properly, and you left Harry there anyway. I made the best decisions I could with the information available to me, Dumbledore said, but the words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. Harry needed to be prepared for the role he would eventually have to play. His experiences, while regrettable, shaped him into the kind of person who would be willing to sacrifice himself for others. The silence that followed was deafening. Around the table, the Order members stared at their leader with expressions ranging from disappointment to horror to outright disgust. It was Tonks who finally found her voice, her hair cycling rapidly through shades of angry red. You shaped a child to be willing to die, she said, her voice thick with revulsion. You deliberately traumatized him, so he would value his own life so little that he'd be willing to give it up without question. That's not strategy, Albus. That's psychological abuse. The greater good sometimes requires difficult choices, Dumbledore said, but the familiar phrase carried none of its usual conviction. Don't. Sirius's voice was deadly quiet. Don't you dare talk to me about the greater good when you've spent 15 years systematically destroying Harry's sense of self-worth. James and Lily died to save him, and you've been preparing him to throw that sacrifice away ever since. Dumbledore straightened in his chair, drawing on reserves of authority that had served him well for decades. I understand your anger, but we must focus on the present crisis. The investigation threatens to destabilize our entire society at a time when we can least afford it. Voldemort's return is your responsibility to handle, Molly interrupted, her voice sharp as broken glass. Not Harry's. He's a child, Albus, a traumatized child who deserves protection and care, not more manipulation and sacrifice. The Horcrux in his scar could be removed by other means, Remus said quietly. You've known about it all along, haven't you? Known that Harry was carrying a piece of Voldemort's soul, and you let him suffer anyway, because you thought it would make him more compliant when the time came to die. The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Dumbledore aged before their eyes, the weight of his choices settling on his shoulders like a leaden cloak. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I had hoped it wouldn't come to that. I had hoped we could find another way. But you prepared for it anyway, Arthur said. You made sure Harry would be broken enough to accept death as a relief rather than fighting for life. I need your help, Dumbledore said suddenly, abandoning all pretense of justification. "The investigation must be stopped before it goes any further. The damage to our society, the questions it raises about our institutions—" "Our institutions?" Sirius laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Albus, you are the institution. You're the one who placed Harry with abusive relatives. You're the one who knew about it and allowed it to continue. And you're the one who's been manipulating him ever since. If our institutions can't survive scrutiny of that kind of systematic abuse, then maybe they deserve to fall. I can use my influence with certain ministry contacts," Dumbledore continued as though Sirius hadn't spoken. "But I need your support. Your statements that Harry's placement was necessary, that the investigation is politically motivated, that—" "No." Molly's voice carried the finality of a slamming door. "I won't help you cover this up, Albus. I won't be complicit in protecting a system that failed Harry so completely." One by one, the other Order members echoed her refusal. Even those who had been most loyal to Dumbledore over the years found they couldn't stomach the idea of defending actions they now recognized as systematic abuse. By the time the meeting ended, Dumbledore sat alone at the table, the yellow light casting harsh shadows across his face as he contemplated the ruins of his carefully constructed authority. Meanwhile, at the Ministry of Magic, Severus Snape stood outside the door to Amelia Bones's office, his black robes billowing around him as he fought an internal battle that had been raging for days. The summons from the DMLE had been inevitable. As Harry's potions master and head of Slytherin House, he would have been one of the few staff members in regular contact with the boy throughout his Hogwarts years. The irony was not lost on him. For 6 years, he had told himself that his treatment of Harry Potter was justified by the boy's resemblance to his father, by his apparent arrogance and disregard for rules. He had convinced himself that Harry was spoiled, pampered, used to getting his way through fame and privilege. The revelation that Harry had been systematically abused and neglected for most of his life forced Snape to confront the uncomfortable possibility that every assumption he had made had been wrong. He knocked once and entered without waiting for permission, his expression carefully neutral as he faced Amelia Bones across her cluttered desk. She looked up from the files spread before her, her sharp eyes assessing him with professional interest. "Professor Snape," she said formally. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit down." Snape remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that suggested barely controlled tension. "I assume this is about Potter's situation. I should warn you that I have little useful information to provide." "We'll see about that," Amelia replied mildly. "I understand you've taught Harry for 6 years, and that as head of Slytherin House, you've had occasion to observe him outside of formal class settings. Tell me about his physical condition during that time." Snape was quiet for a moment, his black eyes fixed on something beyond Amelia's shoulder. When he spoke, his voice carried an unusual note of uncertainty. He was smaller than his peers, thinner. I attributed it to genetics. His father was also slight of build. And his behavior? His demeanor in your classes? Mediocre at best, inattentive, careless with his preparation, prone to making elementary mistakes that suggested he wasn't applying himself properly. Snape paused, his expression growing troubled. Though now that I think about it, he often seemed distracted during the first few weeks of term. Jumpy, hypervigilant in a way that I now recognize as... "As what, Professor?" "As consistent with trauma response," Snape admitted reluctantly. "He exhibited many of the same behaviors I observed in abused children during my time as a Death Eater. I chose not to see the parallels." Amelia made notes on the parchment before her, her quill scratching softly in the quiet office. "Did you ever observe any specific injuries? Unexplained marks or bruises?" Snape closed his eyes, forcing himself to remember details he had spent years deliberately overlooking. During his 2nd year, he came to class with what appeared to be finger marks around his wrist. When I questioned him about it, he claimed he had fallen down the stairs. I accepted the explanation without further inquiry. And other years? Multiple instances of what I assumed were Quidditch-related injuries that seemed inconsistent with the types of accidents typically sustained during matches. Bruises on his ribs, defensive wounds on his forearms, signs of sleep deprivation that went beyond normal academic stress. Snape opened his eyes, meeting Amelia's gaze directly. I see now that I deliberately ignored evidence that was directly in front of me. Why? The question was simple, but Snape could hear layers of meaning beneath it. Because acknowledging it would have required me to act on it, he said quietly. And acting on it would have meant admitting that I had been wrong about Potter. Not just in small ways, but fundamentally, completely wrong about who he was and what he needed from the adults in his life. Amelia studied his face, noting the genuine distress behind his usual mask of indifference. Professor, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need you to answer honestly. In your professional opinion, was Harry Potter being systematically abused during his time at Hogwarts? Snape was silent for a long moment, wrestling with admissions that went against every instinct for self-preservation he had developed over the years. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, the signs were there from the beginning, and they were consistent across all 6 years I taught him. Anyone with training in recognizing abuse should have identified them immediately. He paused, his hands clenching behind his back. I should have identified them immediately. And why didn't you? Because I wanted to believe that James Potter's son was arrogant and privileged and deserving of whatever hardships he faced. Snape's voice was thick with self-loathing. Because acknowledging his suffering would have meant acknowledging that I had been taking my anger toward his father out on a child who was already being victimized by the adults who should have protected him. After Snape left, Amelia sat alone in her office, staring at the growing pile of evidence that painted an increasingly damning picture of systematic institutional failure. The individual testimonies were heartbreaking enough. Neighbors who had witnessed abuse, healers who had documented injuries, teachers who had ignored obvious signs of trauma. But taken together, they revealed something even more disturbing. A conspiracy of willful blindness that had allowed a vulnerable child to suffer for 15 years while the adults responsible for his welfare looked the other way. A knock at her door interrupted her dark thoughts. "Come in." Her assistant entered, carrying a sealed envelope with the kind of official seals that suggested high-level ministry correspondence. "This just arrived by urgent owl, ma'am, from the Chief Warlock's office." Amelia broke the seal and scanned the contents, her expression growing progressively grimmer as she read. The letter was from Dumbledore himself, written in his characteristic elegant script, requesting a private meeting to discuss matters of mutual concern regarding the Potter investigation. The tone was carefully diplomatic, but Amelia could read the subtext clearly enough. This was an attempt at damage control, an effort to limit the scope of the investigation before it uncovered even more damaging revelations. She set the letter aside and reached for a different file, one that had arrived that morning from the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes. The contents were explosive enough to change the entire trajectory of the investigation. Copies of correspondence between Dumbledore and various ministry officials over the years, obtained through a thorough search of interdepartmental communication records. The earliest letters dated back to 1981, shortly after Harry's initial placement with the Dursleys. In them, Dumbledore discussed the boy's situation with clinical detachment, referring to Harry as the asset and the weapon, rather than by name. One particularly damning excerpt made Amelia's blood run cold. The asset's emotional conditioning proceeds as expected. The experiences provided by his current placement should ensure that he values his own life sufficiently little to make the necessary sacrifice when the time comes. Another letter, dated 1987, contained Dumbledore's response to what appeared to be concerns raised by a ministry official about Harry's welfare. "I understand your reservations about the asset's treatment, But we must remember that temporary discomfort serves the greater good. The asset's willingness to sacrifice himself for others is directly proportional to his belief that he deserves nothing better. Any intervention that improves his conditions would undermine this crucial psychological preparation. Amelia read through the entire file twice, her hands shaking with suppressed fury by the time she reached the final document. These weren't the writings of a man making difficult but necessary decisions. They were the calculated manipulations of someone who viewed a child as nothing more than a tool to be shaped and ultimately discarded. She reached for her quill and began drafting a response to Dumbledore's meeting request. Her words were polite but firm. The investigation would continue, evidence would be gathered according to proper procedures, and no amount of political pressure would deter the DMLE from pursuing justice for Harry Potter. She sealed the letter and sent it off, then turned her attention to the much more difficult task of deciding how to present this new evidence to Harry himself. At the Bones family home, Harry was discovering what it felt like to be part of a normal family dinner conversation. Susan's parents asked about his day at Hogwarts, listened to his answers with genuine interest, and shared stories about their own work and experiences without any expectation that he perform or entertain them in return. The absence of underlying tension, the lack of walking on eggshells, the simple pleasure of eating a meal without fear of criticism or punishment. It was all so foreign that Harry found himself hypervigilant, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Harry," Susan's mother said gently, noticing his tension. "You look like you're expecting something terrible to happen. Is everything all right?" Harry set down his fork, considering how to explain 15 years of conditioning to people who had never experienced anything but love and safety from their families. "I'm not used to..." He gestured helplessly at the warm kitchen, the comfortable conversation, the plate of food that no one had begrudged him. This. Families that actually like each other. Meals where no one gets hurt. I keep waiting for someone to start shouting or throwing things. Susan's parents exchanged a look that was heavy with compassion and understanding. "Harry," Susan's father said carefully, "I want you to understand something. This isn't special treatment because you're our guest. This is just how families are supposed to work. Children are supposed to feel safe and loved and valued. The way you were treated, that wasn't normal, and it wasn't your fault." "I know that intellectually," Harry replied, unconsciously echoing words Madame Clearwater had used. "But knowing it and believing it are different things." Susan reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "That's okay. You don't have to believe it all at once. But maybe you can try to accept that we're not going to hurt you, that you don't have to earn your place here, and that you're allowed to just exist without justifying your worth." That evening, as Harry sat in the Bones family library, attempting to focus on his Transfiguration homework, Susan found him staring blankly at his textbook, his mind clearly elsewhere. "Thinking about the investigation?" she asked, settling into the chair beside his. "Among other things," Harry admitted. "Your aunt sent me a letter today. She wants to meet with me tomorrow to discuss some new evidence they've uncovered. She says it's important that I understand the full scope of what happened to me." Susan studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw and the way his hands gripped his quill too tightly. "Are you ready for that? Learning more about how you were manipulated, I mean." Harry was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the garden where dusk was settling over the neat hedgerows. "I don't think anyone's ever ready to learn that the people who were supposed to protect them were actually working to destroy them. But I think I need to know. I think I need to understand the full truth before I can start figuring out who I am when I'm not being hurt or used." "And who do you think you are?" Susan asked gently. "When you're not being defined by what's been done to you?" Harry turned to look at her, his green eyes bright with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. "I don't know yet. But for the first time in my life, I think I might actually get the chance to find out." The next morning brought Harry to Amelia's office earlier than usual, his stomach churning with anxiety about whatever revelations awaited him. Amelia greeted him with her usual professional warmth, but he could see the strain around her eyes that suggested she was dreading this conversation as much as he was. "Harry," she began, settling across from him with a file thick enough to represent years of correspondence. "I need to share some information with you about Professor Dumbledore's role in your placement and treatment. What I'm about to show you is going to be difficult to hear, but I believe you have the right to know the full truth about what was done to you." Harry nodded, his hands folded tightly in his lap to hide their trembling. "I'm ready." Amelia opened the file and began reading selected excerpts from Dumbledore's correspondence, her voice steady despite the horrific content she was sharing. With each letter, each clinical discussion of Harry's conditioning and preparation, his expression grew more distant, more carefully controlled. When she finished reading, the silence in the office was deafening. Harry sat perfectly still, his face a mask of composure that Amelia recognized as a trauma response, the same careful blankness he had worn during his disciplinary hearing. "Harry," she said gently, "do you understand what this means?" "It means," Harry said, his voice eerily calm, "that every person I trusted, every adult who claimed to care about my welfare, was part of a conspiracy to break me down psychologically so that I would be willing to die when it became convenient for them." He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "It means that 15 years of abuse weren't just neglect or poor judgment. They were deliberate, calculated, designed to ensure that I would never value my own life enough to fight for it." Amelia felt her heart break a little at the resignation in his voice, the way he accepted this devastating revelation as just another disappointment in a life that had been full of them. "Harry, I want you to know that this doesn't define you. What was done to you was unconscionable, but it doesn't determine who you are or what your life is worth." "Doesn't it?" Harry asked, and for the first time since she had started reading, emotion crept into his voice. "How do I know that any thought I've ever had about myself is actually my own? How do I know that my willingness to sacrifice myself for others is genuine heroism rather than just successful conditioning? How do I know who I really am when everything I believe about myself might have been programmed into me by people who saw me as a weapon rather than a person?" The questions hung in the air like an indictment of everyone who had failed him. Amelia reached across her desk and gently touched his hand, feeling how cold his skin was despite the warmth of the office. "I think," she said carefully, "that the fact that you're asking those questions is proof that you're more than what they tried to make you. A weapon doesn't question its purpose or value its own existence. A person does." That afternoon, Professor McGonagall answered the summons to Amelia's office with a sense of dread that had been building for days. As deputy headmistress and head of Gryffindor House, she had been Harry's advocate and protector throughout his time at Hogwarts. The investigation into his home life forced her to confront uncomfortable questions about whether she had done enough, whether she had failed him in ways that might have prevented years of suffering. Amelia received her with professional courtesy, but McGonagall could see the steel beneath the surface politeness. This was not going to be a comfortable conversation. "Professor McGonagall," Amelia began, "I've asked you here to discuss your observations of Harry Potter during his time under your care. Specifically, I want to know what you observed about his physical and emotional condition when he returned from summer holidays." McGonagall straightened in her chair, drawing on decades of experience managing difficult situations. "Mr. Potter always seemed subdued at the beginning of each term. Quiet, withdrawn, somewhat behind his peers academically, due to the poor educational foundation provided by his relatives. I attributed this to the adjustment period required when transitioning between very different environments." "And his physical condition?" "He was consistently underweight, often showing signs of malnutrition that we addressed through careful monitoring of his meals. He frequently arrived with minor injuries that he claimed were accidents, cuts, bruises, occasionally more serious trauma that required medical attention. McGonagall's voice grew quieter as she continued. In retrospect, the pattern was troubling. But you didn't report your concerns to the authorities? McGonagall was silent for a long moment, her hands folded tightly in her lap. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of years of suppressed guilt. I discussed my concerns with Professor Dumbledore on multiple occasions. He assured me that Harry's situation was being monitored, that the protection he received from his relatives was more important than the difficulties he experienced there. And you accepted that explanation? I trusted Professor Dumbledore's judgment. I trusted that he had information I wasn't privy to, that his decisions were based on considerations beyond my understanding. McGonagall looked up, meeting Amelia's eyes directly. I was wrong to do so. Amelia leaned forward, her expression serious but not unsympathetic. Professor, as an educator, and as someone in a position of authority over vulnerable children, you had a legal obligation to report suspected abuse to the proper authorities. That obligation existed regardless of whatever reassurances you received from Professor Dumbledore. I understand that now, McGonagall replied, her voice thick with regret. I understand that I failed in my duty to protect a child who was depending on me. I understand that my trust in Professor Dumbledore's authority allowed me to ignore evidence that should have compelled me to act. The question is, what are you prepared to do now? McGonagall straightened, some of her usual steel returning to her voice. Whatever is necessary to ensure that Mr. Potter receives justice and protection. Whatever is necessary to ensure that this kind of systematic failure never happens again. As the afternoon progressed, Amelia met with a series of legal experts who confirmed what she had already suspected. The evidence they had gathered documented multiple violations of wizarding child welfare laws, institutional negligence that rose to the level of criminal conspiracy, and systematic abuse that had been covered up by some of the most powerful figures in their society. The legal implications were staggering. Dumbledore could face charges ranging from child endangerment to conspiracy to commit abuse. The Dursleys faced prosecution for 15 years of systematic violence and neglect. Even Hogwarts could be held liable for failing to report suspected abuse and for allowing the pattern to continue year after year. But beyond the legal ramifications, the investigation had exposed something even more disturbing: the complete failure of every system designed to protect vulnerable children. Harry Potter's suffering hadn't occurred in a vacuum. It had been witnessed, documented, and ultimately enabled by dozens of adults who chose institutional loyalty over a child's welfare. That evening, as Harry helped Susan with her arithmancy homework in the warm comfort of the Bones family library, he found himself thinking about the conversation he'd had with Amelia that morning. The revelations about Dumbledore's correspondence had been devastating, but they had also been strangely liberating. For the first time in his life, he understood that his suffering had a purpose. Not a noble purpose, but a calculated one designed to serve someone else's ends. "You've been quiet tonight," Susan observed, looking up from her calculations. "Thinking about the meeting with Aunt Amelia?" "Among other things," Harry replied, unconsciously echoing his words from the previous evening. "She showed me some letters that Dumbledore wrote about me over the years. Letters that make it very clear that everything that happened to me was deliberate." Susan set down her quill, giving him her full attention. "How do you feel about that?" Harry considered the question seriously, trying to sort through the complex tangle of emotions that had been churning in his chest all day. "Angry," he said finally, "but also relieved, in a strange way. It means that none of it was my fault. All those years when I thought I was being punished because I was inherently wrong or bad or undeserving of love, it turns out I was just being shaped into a weapon. That's horrible, Harry." "It is," he agreed, "but it's also freeing. Because if I was shaped into something I never chose to be, then I can choose to become something else. I can choose to value my own life, to expect kindness from the people around me, to believe that I deserve better than what I was given." Susan reached across the table and took his hand, squeezing gently. "I'm proud of you for recognizing that. It takes incredible strength to reject the narrative that other people have written about your worth." Harry squeezed back, marveling at how natural the gesture felt, how uncomplicated it was to accept comfort and support from someone who offered it freely. "I think," he said slowly, "that I'm starting to understand what friendship is supposed to feel like when it's not built on crisis and shared trauma. What does it feel like?" "Safe," Harry said, and for the first time in his life, he meant it without reservation. "It feels safe." As the evening wound down and the Bones family prepared for bed, Harry found himself thinking about the long road ahead. The investigation was far from over, and there would be trials and testimony and public scrutiny that would be difficult to endure. But for the first time in his life, he was facing that future with genuine support, surrounded by people who valued him for who he was, rather than what he could do for them. He thought about Dumbledore, sitting alone in his office at Hogwarts, watching his carefully constructed authority crumble as the truth about his manipulations came to light. He thought about the Dursleys, facing legal consequences for 15 years of cruelty that they had convinced themselves was justified. He thought about the adults who had witnessed his suffering and chosen to look away, who were now being forced to confront their own complicity in his abuse. But mostly, he thought about the future, about the possibility of a life lived on his own terms, guided by his own choices rather than someone else's strategy. It was a foreign concept, but sitting in the warm safety of the Bones family home, surrounded by people who cared about him unconditionally, it was beginning to feel achievable. The investigation had taken everything from him: his privacy, his carefully maintained facades, his illusions about the people he had trusted. But in return, it had given him something infinitely more valuable: the truth about his worth as a person and the chance to build a life based on that truth rather than on the lies that others had told him about himself. For Harry Potter, that was more than enough to justify whatever challenges lay ahead. Chapter 6. The Horcrux Revelation. The Cursebreaker's examination room in the Department of Mysteries felt more like a tomb than a place of learning. Deep beneath the ministry, protected by wards that would have impressed ancient Egyptian pharaohs, healer Lysander Blackwood prepared to conduct what might be the most significant magical analysis of his career. The room's walls were carved with protective runes that seemed to pulse with their own internal light, and the air hummed with the kind of power that made lesser wizards nervous. Harry Potter sat in the center of a complex ritual circle, his face pale but determined, as Blackwood made final adjustments to the detection arrays. Around the circle, 3 other experts watched with expressions ranging from professional curiosity to barely concealed dread. They had all read the preliminary reports, had all understood the implications of what they might find, but none of them were truly prepared for what the analysis would reveal. "Are you certain you want to proceed with this, Mr. Potter?" Blackwood asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen too many dark discoveries over the years. "Once we begin this examination, there will be no hiding from whatever we find." Harry nodded, his hands resting flat on his knees in that familiar gesture of controlled tension. "I need to know. I need to understand what I've been carrying all these years." Amelia Bones stood just outside the ritual circle, her expression grim as she watched the preparations. She had insisted on being present for this examination, despite the potential dangers involved in analyzing unknown dark magic. The investigation had already revealed horrors beyond her imagination, but she had a sick certainty that the worst was yet to come. Blackwood raised his wand and began the incantation, his voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. The detection spells were ancient and complex, designed to reveal the deepest secrets of magical essence and spiritual integrity. As the magic built around Harry, The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing down on everyone, present with a weight that was almost physical. The first indication that something was wrong came when the protective wards began to react. The carved runes on the walls flared from their usual soft glow to harsh, warning brightness, and the detection arrays around Harry started to resonate with frequencies that made everyone's teeth ache. "By Merlin's beard," whispered one of the observing experts, his face draining of color as the magical readings became visible. "That's not possible." The analysis revealed Harry's magical signature in layers of stunning complexity. His own magic shone bright and pure at the core, recognizably human in its patterns and resonance, but wrapped around it, like a parasite clinging to healthy tissue, was something else entirely, something dark and fragmented and utterly alien to human magical nature. Blackwood's hand shook as he adjusted the detection parameters, trying to get a clearer reading on the foreign magical signature. "It's a soul fragment," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ancient magic, incredibly sophisticated, bound to the boy's life force through blood and trauma." "A Horcrux," Amelia said, the word falling from her lips like a curse. "Harry's been carrying a piece of Voldemort's soul since he was a baby." The implications hit everyone in the room simultaneously. Harry's survival of the killing curse, his connection to Voldemort's thoughts and emotions, his ability to speak Parseltongue, it all suddenly made horrifying sense. But more than that, it explained why Dumbledore had been so determined to keep Harry isolated, traumatized, and ultimately expendable. "How long has it been there?" Harry asked, his voice surprisingly steady, given the magnitude of what they had just discovered. "Since the night your parents died," Blackwood replied, his professional composure cracking slightly. "The soul fragment attached itself to you when Voldemort's killing curse rebounded. It's been growing stronger over the years, fed by your own magical development." Harry was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation with the same careful control he had shown throughout the investigation. "And Dumbledore knew," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "He had to have known," Amelia replied, her voice thick with disgust. "The magical signatures are too distinctive to miss, too powerful to hide from someone with his expertise. He's known since you were a child that you were carrying a piece of Voldemort's soul." The Cursebreaker's examination concluded with a detailed analysis that left everyone in the room shaken. The soul fragment wasn't just present, it was integrated into Harry's magical core in ways that would make removal incredibly dangerous. Worse, the fragment had been slowly influencing Harry's development over the years, subtly shaping his thoughts and emotions in ways that served Voldemort's ends. "The good news," Blackwood said as he deactivated the detection arrays, "is that the fragment is contained and relatively stable. The bad news is that removing it safely would require months of preparation and carry significant risk to Mr. Potter's life." "Or," said one of the other experts grimly, "it could be removed through the host's death, which would destroy the fragment along with the person carrying it." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the room understood the implication. Dumbledore had known that killing Harry would destroy the Horcrux, and he had spent 15 years preparing the boy to accept his own death as necessary and inevitable. Later that day, Amelia sat in her office with the examination results spread before her, trying to process the full scope of Dumbledore's manipulation. The old wizard hadn't just placed Harry with abusive relatives to toughen him up or prepare him for war. He had systematically destroyed the boy's sense of self-worth to make him more willing to die when the time came to eliminate Voldemort's Horcrux. A knock at her door interrupted her dark thoughts. "Come in." Harry entered quietly, his expression carefully neutral, despite the earth-shattering revelations of the morning. "Madam Bones, I wanted to thank you for arranging the examination. I know it wasn't easy to organize." Amelia studied his face, noting the subtle signs of strain beneath his composed exterior. "How are you processing this news, Harry? It can't be easy to learn that you've been carrying a piece of Voldemort's soul all these years. Harry settled into the chair across from her desk, his movements careful and controlled. Honestly, it's almost a relief. It explains so many things that never made sense before. The nightmares, the connection to his thoughts, the way I could understand Parseltongue. I've spent years thinking I was going mad, or that there was something fundamentally wrong with me. And now that you know the truth, now I understand that there is something wrong with me. But it's not my fault, and it's not permanent. Harry leaned forward slightly, his green eyes bright with a determination that surprised Amelia. The Cursebreaker said the fragment could be removed safely with proper preparation. That means I don't have to die to destroy it. Amelia felt a fierce surge of protectiveness toward the young man sitting across from her. No, you don't. And I want you to know that this department will do everything in its power to ensure that you get the help you need to remove that fragment safely. Even if it takes months, even if it's expensive or complicated or politically inconvenient. Even then, Amelia said firmly, Harry, you're not a weapon to be used and discarded. You're a person with inherent worth and the right to live a full life free from the burdens that others have placed on you. Harry was quiet for a moment, absorbing words he had never expected to hear from an authority figure. Madam Bones, can I ask you something? Of course. If Dumbledore knew about the Horcrux all along, if he knew that my death would destroy it, then why didn't he just arrange for me to die quietly when I was younger? Why go through all the trouble of raising me and training me and preparing me for some grand sacrifice? The question hung in the air like an accusation against everyone who had been complicit in Harry's manipulation. Amelia considered her response carefully, knowing that her words would shape how Harry understood his own worth and place in the world. Because, she said finally, you were never meant to be just a sacrifice. You were meant to be a willing sacrifice. Dumbledore needed you to choose death over life, to walk to your own execution with full understanding of what you were doing. A martyred hero who chose to die for the greater good would be much more useful to his cause than a murder victim. Harry absorbed this with the same careful control he had shown all day. So all those years of abuse, all the isolation and manipulation and psychological conditioning, it was all to ensure that when the time came, I would see death as a relief rather than a tragedy. I believe so, yes. And the blood protection that supposedly required me to stay with the Dursleys was probably unnecessary from the beginning. The Cursebreaker's analysis suggests that your mother's protective magic was bound to you personally, not to your location or your relatives. Dumbledore could have placed you anywhere and maintained the same level of protection. Harry leaned back in his chair, a bitter smile playing at the corners of his mouth. So 15 years of abuse were completely unnecessary. I could have been raised by loving guardians, could have grown up feeling valued and protected, and none of it would have compromised my safety. That's correct. But then I might have valued my own life too much to throw it away when Dumbledore decided it was time. Amelia nodded, her heart breaking a little more with each revelation. I think that's exactly what he was afraid of. That evening, the emergency session of the Wizengamot convened in an atmosphere of barely controlled chaos. Word of the Horcrux discovery had leaked despite the Ministry's efforts at secrecy, and the magical community was reeling from the implications. The boy who lived wasn't just a hero who had survived the killing curse. He was a living Horcrux, carrying a piece of their greatest enemy's soul. Albus Dumbledore sat in the defendant's chair, his usual serene demeanor replaced by something approaching desperation. Around him, the members of the Wizengamot whispered among themselves, their expressions ranging from shock to disgust to outright betrayal. The man who had been their moral authority for decades was facing the complete collapse of his reputation and authority. Professor Dumbledore, Amelia said formally, her voice carrying clearly through the stone chamber. You stand accused of willful endangerment of a minor, conspiracy to commit abuse, and deliberate concealment of information crucial to the safety of our community. How do you answer these charges?" Dumbledore rose slowly, his age seeming to weigh on him more heavily than usual. "I acknowledge that my actions may appear questionable when viewed without proper context, but I maintain that everything I have done has been in service of the greater good." "The greater good," repeated Augusta Longbottom, her voice dripping with contempt. "Professor, we've read the reports. We know about the Horcrux. We know about your correspondence discussing Harry Potter as a weapon to be shaped and ultimately sacrificed. How does deliberately traumatizing a child serve any conceivable notion of good?" Dumbledore's composure cracked slightly, revealing the strain of defending actions that even he was beginning to question. The fragment of Voldemort's soul in Harry's scar created an unprecedented situation. Traditional approaches to protection and preparation were inadequate. Extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary measures. "Extraordinary measures," Amelia said, her voice deadly quiet. "Is that what you call 15 years of systematic abuse? Is that how you justify conditioning a child to accept his own death as inevitable?" "Harry's willing sacrifice was the only way to ensure Voldemort's permanent defeat," Dumbledore replied, but his voice carried none of its usual conviction. "The prophecy made it clear that one would have to die for the other to survive. I simply prepared Harry to make that sacrifice willingly when the time came." The admission sent shock waves through the chamber. Several Wizengamot members gasped audibly, while others muttered angrily among themselves. The chief prosecutor, a stern witch named Madame Clearwater, rose from her seat with fire in her eyes. "Professor Dumbledore," she said, her voice cutting through the noise, "are you admitting that you deliberately, psychologically conditioned a child to accept his own death?" Dumbledore was silent for a long moment, his blue eyes fixed on something beyond the assembled lawmakers. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I believed it was necessary." "Necessary," Harry Potter said, stepping into the chamber with Amelia Bones beside him. "That's an interesting word, Professor. I've been hearing it a lot lately." The entire Wizengamot turned to stare at Harry as he approached the witness stand, his presence commanding attention despite his youth. He looked older than his 16 years, aged by revelations that would have broken many adults, but there was steel in his spine that hadn't been there at the beginning of the investigation. "Mr. Potter," the chief warlock said formally, "you've requested permission to address this body. The floor is yours." Harry took his place at the witness podium, his green eyes scanning the faces of the lawmakers before settling on Dumbledore. "I want to tell you what necessary feels like from the receiving end," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the stone chamber. "Necessary feels like being locked in a cupboard for days at a time because your accidental magic scared your relatives. Necessary feels like going to bed hungry more nights than not because food is something you have to earn rather than something you deserve. Necessary feels like learning to hide your pain so well that even you start to believe it's normal." The chamber was absolutely silent, every person present hanging on Harry's words. Several of the female Wizengamot members had tears in their eyes, while others looked sick with disgust. "Necessary feels like believing you're worthless," Harry continued, his voice growing stronger. "Like believing that your only value comes from what you can do for other people, that your life is only meaningful if you're willing to throw it away. Necessary feels like spending 15 years being shaped into the perfect willing victim." He turned his full attention to Dumbledore, who seemed to have aged a decade in the past few minutes. "But here's what I've learned, Professor. None of it was necessary. The blood protection could have been maintained anywhere. The Horcrux could be removed safely with proper preparation. I could have been raised by loving guardians who valued me as a person rather than as a weapon." "Harry," Dumbledore said, his voice cracking with emotion, You must understand. I understand perfectly, Harry interrupted. You needed a martyr, not a hero. You needed someone broken enough to walk willingly to his own execution, not someone who might fight for his life when the time came. You needed a tool, not a person. The words hit Dumbledore like physical blows. Around the chamber, Wizengamot members who had once revered the old wizard looked at him with expressions of growing horror and disgust. "The greater good," Harry said, his voice heavy with irony. "You've used that phrase to justify every horrible decision you've made. But whose good were you really serving, Professor? Because it certainly wasn't mine." Harry stepped down from the witness stand, leaving Dumbledore alone to face the consequences of his choices. The old wizard sat heavily in his chair, the weight of his manipulations finally catching up with him. The Wizengamot's verdict was unanimous, guilty on all charges. At Grimmauld Place, Remus Lupin sat alone in the kitchen that had once housed Order meetings, staring at a copy of the Evening Prophet with unseeing eyes. The headline screamed across the front page, "Dumbledore convicted. Wizengamot finds former Chief Warlock guilty of child abuse conspiracy." The article detailed the trial, including excerpts from Harry's testimony that made Remus's stomach churn with self-recrimination. How had he missed it? How had any of them missed the systematic destruction of a child who had been placed in their care? But even as he asked himself these questions, Remus knew the answers. They had missed it because they hadn't wanted to see it. They had trusted Dumbledore's authority so completely that they had ignored their own instincts, their own observations, their own moral obligations to protect a vulnerable child. The sound of the flue activating drew his attention. Sirius stepped through, his face haggard and his eyes red-rimmed from what might have been crying or drinking, or both. "Did you read it?" Sirius asked without preamble. "Every word," Remus replied quietly. "Multiple times." Sirius slumped into the chair across from him, his usual energy completely drained. "We failed him, Moony. We all failed him. James and Lily died to protect him, and we let Dumbledore destroy him anyway." "We trusted the wrong person," Remus said, but the word sounded hollow even to his own ears. "We thought Dumbledore knew best." "That's not an excuse," Sirius said sharply. "We were Harry's guardians, his godfather, his father's best friends, the people who were supposed to protect him when his parents couldn't. Instead, we handed him over to someone who saw him as expendable and then looked the other way, while he was systematically abused for 15 years. Remus stared down at his hands, seeing James's face in his memory, hearing Lily's laughter from their school days. "What do we do now?" "Now we try to make amends," Sirius said heavily. "We support Harry in whatever he needs. We testify at the trials of everyone who hurt him, and we spend the rest of our lives trying to earn forgiveness we probably don't deserve." "Do you think he'll forgive us?" Sirius was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I don't know," he said finally. "But I know we have to try. We owe him that much, at least." Back at the Bones family home, Harry sat in the garden as twilight settled over the neat hedgerows, processing the events of the most extraordinary day of his life. The Horcrux revelation, the Wizengamot trial, Dumbledore's conviction. It all felt surreal, like something that had happened to someone else. Susan found him there an hour after sunset, bringing a cup of tea and settling beside him on the stone bench without waiting for an invitation. "How are you feeling?" she asked gently. Harry considered the question seriously, trying to sort through the complex tangle of emotions that had been churning in his chest all day. "Free," he said finally. "Terrified, but free. For the first time in my life, I understand that I have choices. Real choices about who I want to be and how I want to live. What kind of choices? Whether to pursue aura training or follow a different path. Whether to maintain relationships with the people who failed me or start fresh with new connections, whether to let my past define me or create a future based on my own values rather than other people's expectations. Susan smiled, bumping his shoulder gently with hers. Those are good choices to have. They are, Harry agreed, but they're also overwhelming. I've spent so many years being told what I was supposed to do, what I was supposed to become, what I was supposed to sacrifice. The idea that I can choose my own path. He shook his head. It's going to take some getting used to. You don't have to figure it all out at once, Susan reminded him. You have time now. Real time, without anyone trying to manipulate you or shape you into something you're not. Harry turned to look at her, noting the way the moonlight caught in her hair and the genuine warmth in her eyes. Susan, can I ask you something? Always. What made you decide to be my friend? Not because your aunt was investigating my case, not because you felt sorry for me, but actually my friend. Susan was quiet for a moment, considering her answer carefully. Because, she said finally, when I talked to you that first time by the lake, I saw someone who was kind, despite having every reason to be bitter. Someone who cared about other people, despite having been failed by almost everyone in his life. Someone who was genuinely good, not because it was easy or expected, but because he chose to be. And that was enough? That was everything, Susan said simply. Harry, you've spent so many years believing that your worth was conditional, that you had to earn love through usefulness or sacrifice. But the truth is, you deserve care and friendship and happiness just because you exist. Not because of what you've done or what you might do, but because you're a person worthy of love. Harry felt tears prick at his eyes, but for once they weren't tears of pain or grief. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of hope for a future he had never dared to imagine. Thank you, he said quietly, for seeing me as more than my circumstances, for believing I could be worth something beyond my usefulness to other people. You don't need to thank me for that, Susan replied, but you're welcome anyway. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged overhead, two young people at the beginning of what might become something beautiful and healing and entirely their own choice. The next morning brought news that sent shockwaves through the entire wizarding community. Albus Dumbledore had been stripped of all his titles and positions, pending further investigation into his role in other ethically questionable decisions over the decades. The Order of the Phoenix had formally disbanded, its members unable to reconcile their commitment to protecting the innocent with their former leader's systematic abuse of a child in their care. More significantly for Harry's future, the Ministry had announced a comprehensive review of child welfare policies, with new protections and oversight procedures designed to prevent future institutional failures. Harry Potter's suffering had exposed weaknesses in their entire system of magical child protection, and the community was determined to ensure that no other child would fall through the cracks as he had. But perhaps most importantly, the curse breakers at St. Mungo's had confirmed that the Horcrux could be safely removed using a combination of ancient rituals and modern healing techniques. The process would take several months and carry some risk, but it offered Harry the chance to reclaim his mind and magic completely, to become truly free from Voldemort's influence for the first time in his life. As Harry prepared for the long road of healing ahead, both from the Horcrux and from 15 years of systematic trauma, he found himself thinking about the conversation he'd had with Susan in the garden. For the first time in his life, he had choices, real choices about who he wanted to become, who he wanted to love, how he wanted to spend the years that had once been marked for sacrifice. The investigation that had begun with Amelia Bones's suspicions about inconsistencies in his hearing had grown into something much larger, a complete examination of the systems and assumptions that had shaped his life, and a radical reimagining of what his future could hold. Harry Potter was no longer the boy who lived, no longer the chosen one, no longer the willing sacrifice prepared for the greater good. He was simply Harry, a young man with a difficult past and an unlimited future, surrounded by people who valued him for who he was, rather than what he could do for them, and for the first time in his life, that felt like enough. Chapter 7. Crisis Point. Rita Skeeter's quill moved across the parchment with the fevered intensity of someone who knew she was writing the story of a lifetime. Her second explosive article about Harry Potter's situation was shaping up to be even more devastating than her first, and the implications were staggering enough to bring down the entire wizarding establishment. Horcrux Boy. The shocking truth about Harry Potter's deliberate conditioning, read the headline she had crafted with particular care. The subheading was equally incendiary. How Albus Dumbledore turned the boy who lived into a living weapon designed for death. The article detailed the discovery of the soul fragment in Harry's scar, Dumbledore's systematic conditioning of a child to accept his own death, and the complete failure of every institution that should have protected him. But Rita had gone further than simple reporting. She had tracked down former Order members, interviewed ministry officials, and spoken to Hogwarts staff who were now coming forward with years of suppressed concerns about Harry's treatment. The picture that emerged was of a conspiracy so vast and systematic that it challenged every assumption the wizarding public held about their most revered leaders. Dumbledore wasn't just guilty of poor judgment. He had orchestrated 15 years of psychological abuse with the calculated precision of someone breeding livestock for slaughter. Rita paused in her writing to admire a particularly damning quote she had obtained from a former ministry official. The boy was never meant to survive the war. He was always meant to be a martyr, and Dumbledore made sure he would embrace that role willingly when the time came. The public reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Within hours of the article's publication, angry crowds had gathered outside the ministry, demanding answers and accountability. Protesters filled Diagon Alley, their signs reading, "Justice for Harry Potter," and "Down with the child abusers." The wireless was filled with outraged commentary, and even the most conservative voices in wizarding society were calling for a complete investigation into institutional failures. But the anger wasn't limited to Dumbledore and his co-conspirators. The ministry itself was facing unprecedented criticism for its failure to detect and prevent the systematic abuse of the most famous child in their community. Questions were being raised about every aspect of magical child welfare, and the public's faith in their governing institutions was crumbling with each new revelation. At the ministry, Cornelius Fudge paced his office like a caged animal, his face flushed purple, with a combination of panic and rage. The crisis had escalated beyond anything he had imagined possible, and his carefully constructed political career was disintegrating with each passing hour. "This is a disaster," he muttered, waving a copy of Rita's latest article. "A complete disaster. The public has lost all faith in our institutions. International observers are questioning our competence, and we're facing calls for a complete restructuring of the ministry." Amelia Bones sat across from his desk, her expression carefully neutral despite the storm raging around them. "Minister, the crisis isn't caused by the investigation. It's caused by the 15 years of systematic abuse that the investigation exposed. The public's anger is justified." "Justified or not, it's destroying everything we've worked to build," Fudge snapped. "The Wizengamot is in chaos. Half the department heads are calling for your resignation, and we've got Death Eaters trying to exploit the situation to destabilize our entire government." As if summoned by his words, the emergency alarm began sounding throughout the ministry, its shrill note indicating an immediate security threat. Amelia was on her feet instantly, her hand moving to her wand as training and instinct took over. "What's the situation?" she demanded, as her secretary burst through the door, her face pale with alarm. "Attack on the Potter safe house," the woman gasped. "Death Eaters, at least 6 of them. They're trying to get to Harry." Amelia felt her blood turn to ice. She had known this moment would come, had prepared for it as best she could, but the reality of Death Eaters targeting Harry in his moment of vulnerability was still a shock. "Deploy the emergency response team immediately. I want every available aura mobilized." She turned to Fudge, whose face had gone from purple to ashen grey. "Minister, I need full authorization to use any necessary force to protect Harry Potter. No restrictions, no political considerations." "You have it," Fudge said quickly. "Just make sure the boy survives. If Harry Potter dies while under ministry protection—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. The political ramifications would be catastrophic. At the Bones family home, the attack came without warning. Harry had been sitting in the garden with Susan, working through a particularly difficult transfiguration assignment, when the first curse shattered the protective wards around the property. The explosion of magical energy sent both teenagers sprawling, and Harry's first coherent thought was not for his own safety, but for the family that had welcomed him. "Susan, get inside," he shouted over the sound of spellfire. "Get your parents to the safe room." But even as he spoke, Harry could see that escape might not be possible. 6 figures in Death Eater masks had apparated into the garden, their wands already trained on the house. The lead figure, tall, aristocratic, and radiating malevolent authority, could only be Lucius Malfoy. "Harry Potter," Malfoy called across the garden, his voice carrying clearly despite the chaos around them. "How fitting that we should meet again under such circumstances. Our master is very interested in speaking with you about the modifications that have been made to your person." Harry felt his scar burn with familiar pain, but this time the sensation was different, muted somehow by the protective spells the curse breakers had woven around the Horcrux fragment. Voldemort was trying to access his mind, to use their connection to influence the battle, but the safeguards were holding. "Tell Voldemort," Harry said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice, "that I'm not his Horcrux anymore. I'm not anyone's weapon. I'm just Harry Potter, and I choose to live." The words seemed to enrage Malfoy beyond reason. "You dare speak the Dark Lord's name? You dare defy your purpose?" He raised his wand, dark magic crackling around its tip. "Avada Ked!" The killing curse was cut short by a barrage of stunning spells as the Ministry response team arrived in force. Auras apparated into the garden from multiple directions, their formation suggesting months of planning for exactly this scenario. Amelia Bones materialized directly between Harry and Malfoy, her wand steady as she faced down the Death Eater leader. "Lucius Malfoy," she said, her voice deadly calm despite the chaos around them. "You're under arrest for attempted murder, assault on ministry personnel, and violation of the International Statute of Secrecy." The battle that followed was brief but vicious. The Death Eaters, caught off guard by the speed and coordination of the ministry response, found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered. 3 were captured immediately. 2 managed to escape through emergency portkeys, and Malfoy himself was stunned unconscious while attempting to curse Harry directly. As the smoke cleared and the auras secured the scene, Harry found himself shaking not from fear, but from something approaching rage. The attack had been designed to exploit his vulnerability, to strike at him during his moment of greatest emotional distress. It was yet another reminder that even now, even after everything that had been exposed, there were people who saw him as nothing more than a tool to be used or destroyed. But more than that, the attack had put the Bones family in danger. Susan's parents, who had welcomed him with open arms and unconditional love, had nearly been killed because of their association with him. The guilt of that realization was almost overwhelming. "Harry," Susan said, appearing at his side with a cut on her forehead, but otherwise unharmed. "Are you all right?" He looked at her. This girl who had shown him kindness without expectation, who had defended him without being asked, who had nearly died because she had offered him friendship, and felt something inside him break. "No," he said quietly. "I'm not all right. I don't think I ever will be." That evening, as news of the Death Eater attack spread throughout the wizarding community, Harry sat alone in his temporary room at the Ministry safe house, staring out at the London skyline and trying to process the full scope of what his life had become. The investigation had exposed the truth about his upbringing. But that truth was almost too horrific to comprehend. He had been systematically abused, not through neglect or poor judgment, but through calculated design. Every blow from Vernon's fist, every night spent locked in the cupboard, every moment of hunger and despair had been orchestrated to shape him into the perfect willing sacrifice. He was carrying a piece of Voldemort's soul in his head, a fragment of pure evil that had been influencing his thoughts and emotions for 16 years. The nightmares, the connection to the Dark Lord's mind, the way violence seemed to follow him everywhere. It all suddenly made terrifying sense. And now, even as he tried to build something resembling a normal life, Death Eaters were targeting him and everyone he cared about. The Bones family, who had done nothing but show him kindness, had nearly been killed because of their association with him. How many more people would suffer because Harry Potter existed in their world? The knock at his door was soft, hesitant. "Come in," he said, without turning from the window. Amelia Bones entered quietly, her expression carefully neutral as she studied his posture. "How are you holding up, Harry?" He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "How am I supposed to be holding up? I just learned that my entire life has been a lie, that every person I trusted was either complicit in my abuse or actively orchestrating it. I'm carrying a piece of the most evil wizard in history inside my head, and Death Eaters are trying to kill anyone who shows me kindness. I know it's overwhelming." "Overwhelming?" Harry turned from the window, his green eyes bright with unshed tears. "Madam Bones, I was raised like livestock, fed just enough to keep me alive, beaten just enough to break my spirit, isolated just enough to ensure I would never value my own life. And it worked. For 15 years, it worked perfectly." Amelia moved closer, her expression shifting from professional concern to genuine compassion. "Harry, what happened to you was unconscionable. But you're not livestock. You're not a weapon. You're a person with inherent worth and the right to choose your own path." "Am I?" Harry asked, and his voice carried a desperation that made Amelia's heart ache. "How do I know that anything I think or feel is actually mine? How do I know that my desire to protect people isn't just conditioning? How do I know that my willingness to fight Voldemort isn't exactly what Dumbledore programmed me to do?" The questions hung in the air between them, highlighting the devastating scope of psychological manipulation that Harry had endured. Amelia realized with growing horror that the investigation had exposed not just physical abuse, but something much more insidious: the complete destruction of a child's ability to trust his own thoughts and emotions. "I think," she said carefully, "that the fact that you are questioning these things proves that you are more than your conditioning. A weapon doesn't doubt its purpose. A tool doesn't question its programming. But a person fights to understand who they really are, beneath the lies others have told them." Harry stared at her for a long moment, searching her face for signs of deception or manipulation. "Do you really believe that?" "I believe it absolutely," Amelia replied without hesitation. "Harry, you've survived 15 years of systematic abuse and come out the other side with your capacity for kindness intact. You've learned that you were carrying a piece of Voldemort's soul and chosen to fight for your own life rather than accept the death that was planned for you. That's not conditioning. That's courage." Meanwhile, in the emergency session of the Wizengamot that had been convened to address the crisis, the atmosphere was one of barely controlled chaos. The revelation about Harry's Horcrux status had sent shockwaves through the magical community that were still reverberating, and the Death Eater attack had only intensified the public's demand for accountability. Minister Fudge stood at the podium, his face pale and drawn as he addressed the assembled lawmakers. "The situation has reached a critical point," he began, his voice carrying none of its usual pompous authority. "Public confidence in our institutions has been severely damaged, and we're facing unprecedented challenges to the stability of our government." From her seat in the gallery, Augusta Longbottom rose to address the chamber. "Minister, the public's loss of confidence is entirely justified. We have failed in our most basic responsibility, protecting a vulnerable child from systematic abuse. The question is not whether we've lost credibility, but whether we deserve to maintain any authority at all." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. Several other Wizengamot members stood to voice their own concerns about institutional failures, and the session quickly devolved into a heated debate about responsibility, accountability, and the need for sweeping reforms. "I call for the immediate resignation of everyone who knew about Mr. Potter's situation and failed to act," declared Madam Clearwater, her voice carrying clearly through the stone chamber. "This includes Minister Fudge, who was briefed on the boys' welfare multiple times over the years and chose to defer to Professor Dumbledore rather than investigate independently. I call for a complete restructuring of our child welfare protocols," added another member. "Every magical child should have access to independent advocates who can report suspected abuse without fear of political retaliation." As the debate raged around him, Fudge felt his grip on power slipping away with each passing moment. The crisis had exposed weaknesses in his leadership that he couldn't explain away, failures in judgment that he couldn't justify. His political career, built on avoiding difficult decisions and deferring to more powerful figures, was crumbling under the weight of consequences he had spent years trying to avoid. At Hogwarts, the atmosphere was equally chaotic, as students and faculty struggled to process the implications of Harry's situation. The revelation that their most famous student had been systematically abused while under the school's care raised uncomfortable questions about institutional responsibility and the failure of adults to protect vulnerable children. Hermione Granger sat in the empty Gryffindor common room, staring at her Transfiguration textbook without really seeing the words on the page. Around her, the familiar warmth and comfort of her house common room felt hollow, meaningless in the face of what she had learned about her best friend's experiences. How had she missed it? How had she, who prided herself on being observant and analytical, failed to recognize the signs of systematic abuse in someone she saw every day? The guilt was eating at her like acid, making it impossible to focus on anything except the litany of signs she should have noticed. Harry's reluctance to discuss his home life, his careful way of deflecting questions about his relatives, the way he flinched sometimes when adults raised their voices. The fact that he was always thin at the beginning of term, always seemed tired and withdrawn for the first few weeks back at school. She had attributed it all to Harry being private, to his discomfort with fame, to the natural adjustment period between the magical and muggle worlds. But now she understood that she had been willfully blind, choosing comfortable explanations over difficult truths because acknowledging Harry's suffering would have required her to act on it. "Hermione?" Ron's voice broke through her dark thoughts. She looked up to find him standing in the entrance to the common room, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly. "Can we talk?" She nodded, closing her textbook and making room for him on the sofa. They sat in silence for a long moment, both struggling with guilt too vast to put into words. "I keep thinking," Ron said finally, "about all the times I complained about going home for holidays. All the times I moaned about Mum being overprotective, or Percy being annoying, or the twins playing pranks. And Harry just listened, never said anything about what he was going home to." "Because he thought it was normal," Hermione whispered. "He thought that's what families were supposed to be like. And we never questioned it. We never asked why he never wanted to talk about the Dursleys, why he never had friends over during the summer, why he always seemed so relieved to be back at school." Ron's voice was thick with self-recrimination. "We were supposed to be his best friends, and we didn't even notice he was being tortured." Hermione felt tears begin to stream down her cheeks. "We failed him, Ron. He was counting on us to see what was happening, to help him, and we just didn't." "What do we do now?" Ron asked. "How do we make up for 15 years of not protecting him?" "I don't know if we can," Hermione admitted, "but we have to try. We have to be better friends than we were before, and we have to make sure he knows that we see him now, really see him, not just the hero everyone expects him to be. Back at the ministry, the pressure on Amelia Bones to resign was mounting with each passing hour. Department heads who had once supported her investigation were now calling for her removal, arguing that her handling of the case had caused irreparable damage to public confidence in their institutions. "You've destabilized our entire government," accused Rufus Scrimgeour, his scarred face twisted with anger. "The public is rioting in the streets. Our international relationships are in shambles, and we're facing the complete collapse of institutional authority." Amelia faced down her critics with the same steady resolve she had shown throughout the investigation. "The public is rioting because they've learned that we allowed a child to be systematically abused for 15 years, while our most trusted leaders looked the other way. Their anger is justified. Justified or not, it's destroying everything we've worked to build," Scrimgeour shot back. "We need stability, not more chaos. We need someone who can restore public confidence, not someone who keeps exposing institutional failures." "What we need," Amelia said firmly, "is accountability. We need leaders who are willing to face difficult truths rather than covering them up for political convenience. And we need a system that protects vulnerable children instead of sacrificing them for the perceived greater good." The debate continued late into the night, with Amelia defending her decisions while her critics demanded her resignation. But even as she fought for her position, she knew that the real battle wasn't political. It was for Harry's future, and for the principles that should govern how their society treated its most vulnerable members. At the safe house, Susan Bones found Harry exactly where she had expected, sitting alone on the roof, staring up at the stars as though searching for answers in their distant light. The attack that afternoon had shaken everyone, but Harry seemed to have retreated deep inside himself, withdrawing from the world in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of their first conversations by the Hogwarts lake. "Mind if I join you?" she asked softly. Harry looked up, his expression carefully neutral, despite the turmoil she could see in his green eyes. "It's not safe to be around me, Susan. Today proved that. Today proved that there are dangerous people in the world who want to hurt you," she corrected, settling beside him despite his protest. "That's not your fault, isn't it?" Harry's voice carried a bitterness that made her heart ache. "Everyone who tries to help me ends up in danger. Your family, Ron and Hermione, even your aunt. They're all targets now because they chose to care about me." Susan studied his profile, noting the way he held himself apart, even while sitting beside her. "Harry, you can't live your life in isolation, just because caring about you comes with risks. Everyone who loves someone takes risks. That's what love means. But the risks shouldn't be Death Eater attacks and attempted murder," Harry replied. "The people I care about shouldn't have to face that because they chose to be kind to me. The people you care about are adults who can make their own decisions about acceptable risks," Susan said firmly. "And I think you'd be surprised how many of them would choose to face those risks rather than abandon you to face them alone." Harry was quiet for a long moment, processing her words. "Susan, can I ask you something?" "Always." "Do you ever wonder what your life would be like if you'd never met me? If you'd never gotten involved in all this chaos and danger?" Susan considered the question seriously, understanding that her answer would matter more than casual reassurance. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But then I remember that my life would also be missing something incredibly important, the friendship of someone who taught me what real courage looks like." "Courage?" Harry laughed bitterly. "Susan, I spent 15 years being too afraid to tell anyone what was happening to me. I was too much of a coward to ask for help when I needed it most." "You were a child," Susan said fiercely. "A child who was systematically taught that asking for help would only make things worse. That's not cowardice. That's survival in an impossible situation." She turned to face him directly, her expression intense in the moonlight. "Harry, you want to know what courage looks like? It looks like choosing to trust people again after being betrayed by everyone who should have protected you. It looks like deciding to value your own life after being taught that you were worthless. It looks like sitting here with me instead of disappearing into hiding because you're afraid I might get hurt." Harry stared at her for a long moment, seeing something in her face that he couldn't quite identify. "You really believe that?" "I believe that you're one of the bravest people I've ever met," Susan said without hesitation. "Not because you've faced down Death Eaters or survived the killing curse, but because you've survived 15 years of systematic abuse and come out the other side with your humanity intact." As the night deepened around them, Harry found himself thinking about Susan's words, about the possibility that his suffering might not have broken him as completely as he had feared. The investigation had exposed the full scope of what had been done to him, had revealed the calculated nature of his conditioning and manipulation. But maybe, just maybe, it had also revealed something else. Evidence that he was stronger than the people who had tried to destroy him, more resilient than the forces that had sought to shape him into a weapon. The crisis was far from over. The wizarding world was reeling from revelations that challenged every assumption about their most trusted leaders. Death Eaters were exploiting the chaos to target him and everyone he cared about. The political ramifications were still unfolding, and the social consequences would be felt for years to come. But sitting on the roof of the safe house, surrounded by stars and the quiet presence of someone who cared about him unconditionally, Harry began to understand something that Dumbledore's conditioning had never prepared him for. He was not alone in this fight. He had people who would stand with him, not because they saw him as useful, but because they saw him as worth protecting. And for the first time since learning the full truth about his past, that felt like enough reason to keep fighting for his future. Chapter 8. The Lowest Point. Harry woke from another nightmare to find his hands shaking uncontrollably and his shirt soaked through with cold sweat. The dreams had been getting worse since the Horcrux revelation. Twisted visions where he couldn't tell which thoughts were his own and which belonged to the fragment of Voldemort's soul that had been poisoning his mind for 16 years. In tonight's nightmare, he had been standing in a mirror that showed not his reflection, but Dumbledore's, and when he tried to speak, Voldemort's voice had emerged from his mouth. When he reached out to touch his own face, his hands had been covered in the blood of everyone he had ever cared about. He sat up slowly, pressing his palms against his eyes until stars burst behind his eyelids. The safe-house bedroom felt like a prison, all beige walls and sterile furniture designed to be anonymous and forgettable. Through the heavily warded windows, he could see the lights of London stretching away into the distance, millions of people living their lives without carrying pieces of dark wizards in their heads, or bringing death to everyone they touched. The medical reports from the curse breakers lay scattered on his bedside table, detailed analyses of how to safely remove the Horcrux fragment that made for grim reading. Months of preparation, dangerous rituals, no guarantee of success, and all of it requiring Harry to believe that his life was worth the risk, worth the effort, worth saving at all. That was the part he couldn't get past. How could he ask people to risk their lives and careers to save him when he wasn't even sure there was anything worth saving? How could he claim to be anything more than a weapon shaped by abuse when he didn't know where the conditioning ended and his actual personality began? He had tried to read, tried to study, tried to focus on anything that might make him feel human again. But every book reminded him of Hermione's disappointed face when she learned how thoroughly she had failed to recognize his suffering. Every assignment reminded him of the Hogwarts teachers who had seen the evidence of abuse and chosen to look the other way. Every moment of quiet reminded him of the Death Eaters who wanted to kill him and anyone foolish enough to care about him. A soft knock at his door made him tense. "Harry." Susan's voice was gentle, careful. "Are you awake?" He considered pretending to be asleep, but the effort of maintaining even that small deception felt beyond him. "Come in." Susan entered, carrying a tray with tea and what looked like homemade biscuits, her face creased with concern as she took in his appearance. "You look terrible," she said bluntly, setting the tray on his desk and settling into the chair beside his bed. "I feel terrible," Harry admitted. "Susan, I can't do this anymore." The words hung between them like a confession. Susan studied his face, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the hollow expression that had been growing worse each day since the Horcrux revelation. "What exactly can't you do?" Harry gestured helplessly at himself, at the room, at the world beyond the windows. "Any of it. The investigation, the trials, the medical procedures to remove the Horcrux, pretending that I'm anything more than a broken weapon that's outlived its usefulness. Watching people I care about get hurt because they're associated with me." "Harry, no, listen to me," Harry said, his voice growing more urgent. "Everyone would be better off if I just disappeared. The wizarding world could move on from this crisis, Voldemort would lose his connection to me, and the people I care about would stop being targets. It's the only logical solution." Susan was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what he was saying. "Harry, are you talking about running away, or are you talking about something more permanent?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Harry looked at her. This girl who had shown him kindness without expectation, who had defended him without being asked, and realized that he didn't actually know the answer. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I honestly don't know anymore." Susan reached across the space between them and took his hand, her touch warm and grounding in a way that reminded him he was still capable of feeling something other than despair. "Harry, I need you to listen to me very carefully. The thoughts you're having right now, about disappearing, about everyone being better off without you, those aren't your thoughts. Those are the thoughts that 15 years of conditioning programmed into you. How can you be sure? Because," Susan said firmly, "the real you, the person you are underneath all the manipulation and abuse, would never believe that the world would be better off without kindness, without someone who fights to protect innocent people, without someone brave enough to question the narrative that others have written about his worth." Harry stared at her, wanting desperately to believe her words, but finding it impossible to reconcile them with the voice in his head that insisted he was nothing more than a burden, a danger, a weapon that had malfunctioned and needed to be discarded. "What if you're wrong?" he whispered. "What if this is who I really am? What if the conditioning worked so well that there's nothing left underneath it?" Susan was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Then we'll find out together," she said finally. "But I don't believe that's true. I've seen who you are when you think no one is watching, when you're not performing or trying to be what others expect. I've seen your kindness, your humor, your capacity for joy when you let yourself experience it. That person is real, Harry. That person is worth fighting for." Meanwhile, in the minister's office, Amelia Bones faced the most difficult decision of her professional life. Across from her desk sat Kingsley Shacklebolt, his expression grim as he delivered a message that could end her career and potentially derail the entire investigation. "The offer comes from the highest levels," Kingsley said, his voice carefully neutral. "Full pension, commendation for distinguished service, and a comfortable post in the International Confederation of Wizards. All you have to do is resign quietly and recommend that the Potter investigation be transferred to a more diplomatic department." Amelia studied the formal document Kingsley had placed before her, noting the impressive seals and signatures that represented decades of accumulated political power. And in return, the investigation gets buried under layers of bureaucracy until the public loses interest. The politically damaging aspects get classified for national security reasons, and everyone involved gets to save face while returning to business as usual. The proposal was elegant in its cynicism, offering her a way out that would preserve her reputation while effectively ending any hope of justice for Harry Potter. She could accept the promotion, walk away from the chaos she had unleashed, and spend the rest of her life comfortable in the knowledge that she had tried to do the right thing, even if she hadn't succeeded. "What about Harry?" she asked. Kingsley's expression grew troubled. He would receive the medical care he needs to remove the Horcrux, along with appropriate financial support and protection, but there would be no trials, no public accountability, no structural reforms to prevent future institutional failures. So everyone who participated in his abuse faces no consequences. They face the consequence of having their reputations tarnished and their authority diminished. For people like Dumbledore, that's a form of justice. Amelia leaned back in her chair, considering the implications of the choice before her. She could take the easy path, accept that she had done as much as one person could reasonably be expected to do, and trust that others would continue fighting for justice even if she stepped aside. Or she could continue pushing forward, knowing that each day brought new political pressure, new threats, new attempts to undermine the investigation that had consumed her life for the past weeks. "And if I refuse the offer?" Kingsley's expression grew even more grim. "Then the pressure continues to escalate. More calls for your resignation, more attempts to discredit the investigation, more political maneuvering to protect the people who failed Harry. Eventually, they'll find a way to remove you from the case anyway. But by then your reputation and career will be completely destroyed." The choice was clear, even if it wasn't easy. Amelia could save herself and hope that someone else would continue the fight, or she could sacrifice her own future in a probably futile attempt to see justice done. She thought about Harry, sitting alone in the safe house, questioning whether his own life was worth the effort required to save it. She thought about the systematic abuse that had been documented, the institutional failures that had been exposed, the conspiracy of willful blindness that had allowed a vulnerable child to suffer for 15 years. "Tell them," she said finally, "that I respectfully decline their generous offer. The investigation continues." Kingsley nodded, but she could see the concern in his eyes. "Amelia, I have to ask, are you sure this is worth destroying your career over? Harry is getting help. The worst perpetrators have been exposed, and the public is demanding reforms. Maybe that's enough." "Maybe," Amelia acknowledged, "but probably not. Partial justice has a way of becoming no justice at all, when the political pressure mounts high enough. If we don't see this through to the end, Harry's suffering will have been for nothing." After Kingsley left, Amelia sat alone in her office, staring at the case files that had consumed her life and wondering if she was making the right choice. The investigation had already cost her politically, had made her enemies among powerful figures who preferred convenient lies to inconvenient truths. Continuing to push forward might cost her everything she had worked for over the decades of her career. But the alternative, walking away and leaving Harry to face the consequences of her incomplete work, was unthinkable. She had made him a promise to see justice done, and she intended to keep it regardless of the personal cost. In the remnants of what had once been the Order of the Phoenix, former allies struggled with the collapse of everything they had believed about their cause and their leader. At the Burrow, Arthur and Molly Weasley sat at their kitchen table, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of their family home, trying to process the magnitude of their failure to protect Harry. "I keep thinking about all the times he came here," Molly said, her voice thick with guilt and tears. "All those summers when he was so grateful for every small kindness, so amazed by the most basic expressions of family love. I thought it was charming, the way he appreciated simple things. I never realized that he was starving for affection because he'd been systematically denied it his entire life," Arthur finished quietly. "That what we saw as humility was actually learned worthlessness." They had received a letter from Harry that morning, delivered by Ministrial, and written in his careful, controlled handwriting. In it, he thanked them for their kindness over the years and expressed his gratitude for the warmth they had shown him. But he also asked them not to visit or contact him while he worked through his recovery, citing the danger to their family and his need for space to figure out who he was when he wasn't being shaped by others' expectations. The letter was polite, grateful, and utterly heartbreaking in its careful distance. "He's protecting us," Molly said, clutching the parchment to her chest. "Even now, after everything that's been done to him, he's still trying to protect us from the consequences of caring about him." "Because that's what he was taught to do," Arthur replied.